Claudia Beatrice, your Wellington name means absolutely nothing here, I roared, standing in front of the gleaming white Lamborghini, revving in the middle of my land. With a hard spin of the wheels, the car sank into the mud, flinging dirt everywhere, turning the two arrogant HOA sisters into a complete joke in front of the entire community. The land spoke for me. Wealth can't save those who look down on others. What state are you in? Would your HOA dare to act this outrageously there? I will never forget that morning. The roar of the engine shattered the quiet air over the field. I was fixing up some old fences when I saw the two sisters, Claudia and Beatrice Wellington, driving a white Maserati straight through my farmland, its tires tearing up freshly tilled soil. A no trespassing sign stood right at the edge of the path, but they acted like it was invisible, speeding up as if putting on a show for the entire neighborhood. In that moment, I realized they weren't just cutting through, they were deliberately stomping over boundaries to prove that HOA power could override any rule. I stepped into their path, raising my arm to signal them to stop. My voice came out clipped, measured, trying to stay calm, though the corners of my mouth were already tight with anger. I told them this was private land, that they were destroying the hard work and peace my family had built. Claudia looked at me through the windshield, then laughed a sharp, bitter laugh laced clear disdain. Beatrice followed, rolling down her window, her voice high-pitched and sneering. You're just a pitiful farmer. No one cares about this land. Those words cut like a blade through my pride. I didn't even have time to respond before the engine screamed again. The tires dug deep into the damp soil, and a wave of mud splashed straight onto me, from chest to boot. I stood frozen, the stench of wet earth and gasoline mixing into something that turned my stomach. But the real humiliation wasn't in the mud, it was in their laughter, echoing across the entire field, each sound a slap to the ear. I stood still, fists clenched tight, veins rising under the skin. Fury surged so hard it was hard to breathe, but I forced it down. In that silence, something solid took shape inside me. If the Wellington sisters thought money and an HOA title were enough to turn someone else's land into their personal playground, they were about to learn a bitter lesson. I turned away quietly, vowing this would not end peacefully. From that day on, I started watching more closely. Every afternoon, that gleaming white Maserati would return, gliding across the fields like a provocation. No hesitation, no slowing down, just tire after tire digging deeper tracks into the land that fed my family. Others might dismiss it as nothing, just a dirt path getting worn down. But to me, it was a blatant violation of both sweat and dignity. They weren't just driving, they were driving with arrogance, with eyes full of contempt. Every time I stood there watching, I could feel my patience being scraped away, inch by inch. There was never a flicker of remorse in their eyes, only the smug defiance of people who believed the neighborhood and the authorities were on their side. Those tires weren't just crushing dirt, they were grinding down the pride of a man who had always lived by his own hands and by what's right. I knew that if I stayed silent, then tomorrow and the days after, no one would respect my boundaries anymore. People like Claudia and Beatrice would keep going, and others would follow. What I was protecting wasn't just farmland, it was the bare minimum line that separates a decent life from the kind that gets trampled without consequence. In the fading sunlight that spilled across the fields, I clenched my fists, letting the mud dry on my clothes. I didn't scream, and I didn't beg. I just took a long, steady breath and told myself it was time for the Wellington sisters to learn what it means to pay the price. The white Maserati no longer drove alone. A few days later, I saw it return with a convoy of gleaming cars, all high-end models that people in the neighborhood called symbols of power. Claudia and Beatrice led the way, followed by a group of friends in bright suits, laughing and talking loudly. The narrow path through my farm had become an unwilling shortcut for the whole group, their tires crushing young grass and grinding over the fresh rows I had planted. I watched from a distance, my gut burning. To them, this was an outing, a performance. They laughed, spoke loudly, pointing across the field as if it were a stage for some theatrical display of wealth. It wasn't just trespassing, it was a show of triumph, rubbed in for the entire village to see. Claudia rolled down the window of a brand new Lamborghini she had borrowed from a friend in the club. A phone camera pointed straight at me, her voice sharp with mockery. Look at this rundown farm. Perfect setting for a comedy. $1 million car deserves a background like this. Beatrice let out a high-pitched laugh, shaking her head with a fake look of pity, like I was just an extra in their video. The group of friends in the cars behind them erupted in laughter, a sound that rang across the field, cold, cruel. I stepped directly into the road, determined not to let this scene play out again. I stood in front of the lead car, pointing down at the ground. Stop. This is my farm. No one gets to make a mess here anymore. I tried to keep my voice low, but the pressure in my chest made it come out sharp, like metal scraping against metal. Claudia leaned on the horn, the shrill sound blasting in rapid bursts. Beatrice lowered her voice, speaking through gritted teeth, her mouth curled in a sneer. Move. You're standing in the way of $1 billion car. They didn't see me as a person, just an obstacle. A misplaced rock on the road meant for the rich. I stood firm, eyes locked on theirs. In my gaze, they could see their own reflection, arrogant and hollow. I knew they were waiting for me to lower my head, to step aside and let them pass. But I didn't move. I heard the phone still recording and understood they wanted to turn this into a moment of entertainment, something to post online, turning me into a laughingstock. But what they didn't see was that every word, every action, was documenting their own extreme arrogance. And one day it would come back to bite them. A few neighbors had quietly gathered by the fence nearby. No one said a word, they just watched. I saw hesitation in their eyes. Some looked sympathetic, others worried, and a few seemed to enjoy seeing me humiliated. They all knew the weight of the Wellington name in this area. Claudia and Beatrice controlled every HOA decision, and anyone who had ever dared to oppose them paid for it. No one had the courage to stand with me. Everyone chose silent, each one protecting their own version of peace. The engine kept growling, heat from the hood blasting against my leg. Claudia tilted her head, her gaze cold as steel. Do you really think standing there will change anything? Someone like you, what right do you have to say no to us? I heard every word, and the sting of humiliation rose again, but instead of stepping back, I drew in a deep breath. In that moment, all hesitation left. I knew I had chosen the hardest path, standing up against the arrogant power of the HOA. I understood retaliation would come, but I also knew that if I backed down now, there would be nothing left to protect. The land, the livestock, the dignity, all of it would slowly vanish beneath their tires. And I swore, from that moment on, I would never let anyone turn my farm into a public joke again. Claudia laughed, her voice full of scorn. Fine then, if you want to be a clown, stay right there. The camera's rolling on a farmer standing in the way of the elite. Tomorrow, the whole neighborhood will see just how pathetic you look. I didn't answer. I stared straight into the lens, letting it record my silence, a silence that was not weakness, fuel for the battle I knew was coming. They revved the engine, then slammed the brakes right in front of me, kicking up a storm of dust. The air reeked of burning rubber. Laughter broke out again, and the neighbors stepped further back. No one stepped in, and I knew that to many of them, I was the man trying to stand against an entire system built on arrogance and class. But it was also in that moment that I felt, more clearly than ever, the value of holding my ground. The tire tracks carved deep into the narrow path, streaks of mud still clinging to my boot. I clenched my fists, drew in the choking air, and one thought echoed through my mind. Fight had officially begun, and I had no intention of losing. I had had enough. The sound of tires grinding against the earth, harsh laughter, and the venomous mockery. I stepped into the dirt road, took a deep breath, and put all my weight into every step forward. Mud from the last encounter still clung to my shirt, and its earthy stench brought back the humiliation they had inflicted. This time, I had no intention of just standing by. This is my land. I do not permission, I said flatly, my voice loud and sharp, landing like a hammer blow. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a declaration of the final boundary. No more halfway measures, no more tolerance. Claudia laughed, a cold, dismissive sound as if my words were nothing but wind. She raised her chin slightly, eyes flashing with contempt. Beatrice leaned out of the car window, her voice high and slicing through the air. You think you have the right to make demands here? A rotting piece of land like this only drags down the value of the whole neighborhood. You should be smart enough to get rid of it. Every word from their mouths landed like thorns digging into my skin. It wasn't just a personal insult, it was an attack on my livelihood, on my dignity. They didn't see a human being standing in front of them, only a man they believed they could trample to elevate themselves. I stayed silent for a few seconds, my eyes locked on theirs. The anger inside me no longer boiled, it had cooled into something far more dangerous. I saw Beatrice lean down, then calmly spit on the ground, right in front of my boot. The sound, paired with her defiant stare, hit like a slap across the face. It wasn't just disrespect, it was a declaration of war. I took a half step forward, locking eyes with them. You will pay for looking down on others, I said, each word sharp and deliberate. It wasn't shouted, but it cut through their armor of arrogance like a blade. I saw Beatrice's face pause for half a second before she burst into mocking laughter. Claudia squinted slightly, a flicker of interest mixed with irritation, as if she had finally spotted a challenger worth crushing. The air around us thickened, broken only by the idle hum of the engine. They thought their scorn would make me retreat, but I stood still, unmoving. I could feel the eyes of the neighbors watching from a distance. None dared to come close, but I knew I had become the center of attention. Some wished I would back down for the sake of, while others silently hoped I would pushing to expose the truth they themselves couldn't speak. I left the spit where it landed, didn't wipe it away, didn't flinch. I wanted them to see that humiliation couldn't bring me down. I wanted them to know the man they looked down on wasn't as easy to crush as the grass beneath their tire. And I knew, from this moment forward, I had stepped fully into a fight I could no longer walk away from. Claudia leaned forward, tapping her fingers lightly against the steering wheel, her eyes gleaming with challenge. Fine, you've chosen to stand in the way. Then be ready. No one crosses Wellington and stays untouched. Her words reeked blood, a cold warning that the war had only just begun. I didn't answer. I took one step back, just enough to look both of them square in the eye. My heart was pounding, but my hands hung loose, steady. The fear was gone. All that remained was a ruthless resolve. In my mind, images flashed by the luxury car flinging mud, the sneering laughter, the spit at my feet. Together, they were fuel for a fire that would not go out. I heard whispers from behind the fence. Someone called my name in a panic, and someone else pulled their children away. They were afraid, because they knew the HOA could crush anyone who dared to resist. But that fear only pushed me further. I could not let my daughter grow up in a place where the rich had the right to humiliate, and no one dared to speak out. I could not let silence become complicity. Beatrice threw her head back and laughed, her voice sharp as a razor. Did you hear that, sister? He's threatening us. A dirt-covered farmer dares to challenge the Wellington. Her laugh rang out, soaked in bitterness. But I didn't flinch. I let them laugh, because I knew the day would come when that laughter would catch in their throats. I turned and walked away without another word. I knew I had planted a seed in this fight, and that seed would grow, digging deep into the very foundation of this neighborhood, until the day it brought them to their knees by the very force they thought controlled. That night, when I came home, my daughter asked why my clothes were dirty. I sat down, looked into her eyes, and saw both innocence and worry. I didn't tell her the detail. I just said, "Daddy has to keep this land safe." She nodded and fell quiet. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for her, and for every generation after, so they wouldn't have to live in the shadow of the arrogant. Inside, I heard a voice ring clear, there would be no more patience. Every step they took, every time their wheels touched this ground, they would pay a price they had never imagined. And I, the man they called a pitiful farmer, would be the one to make them taste it. If it were you, would you have the guts to stand in front of their car to defend your land? Drop a comment below. That morning, the sky was clear, sunlight filtered through every branch, and it was a day that should have begun in peace, with the usual work. I was stacking a few bundles of hay for the cattle when the familiar sound of an engine pierced the air. That sound cut like a blade into my ears, announcing the arrival of two people I had no desire to see. Claudia and Beatrice Wellington. The white Maserati veered close to the edge of the field, avoiding the dirt path they normally took. This time, they deliberately steered toward the livestock pen. I heard tires grinding against the hardened soil, grass blades flung into the air, then the panicked bellowing of the cattle. A few of them startled and scattered in all directions. The chaotic noise from the pen felt like it was ripping my chest open. Amid the commotion, I heard a painful cry. A young calf had been knocked down, its front leg caught between two wooden slats, thrashed in panic, eyes wide and glossy with fear. I rushed over, pushing aside tangled hay and broken boards, my heartbeat slamming with dread, placed my hand on its body, and felt the tremble in that tiny frame. Its leg was twisted, horribly broken, its breath short and jagged, mixed with strangled cries. My whole body shook, not with fear, but with rage. The blood in my veins boiled, every breath a knife slicing through my chest. I lifted the calf out of the trap, trying to hold it steady in my arm. Its eyes met mine, pleading, as if I were the only thing left that could protect it. I spun toward the two cars. They had stopped right in front of the pen, windows down, laughter spilling out. I shouted, the sound bursting out like a roar. "Do you have any conscience left?" My voice echoed across the open space, raw with fury, stripped of all restraint. Claudia raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a bitter smile. Beatrice crossed her arms, her voice sharp as a blade sliding across glass. "Oh, please, they're just cows. Don't be so dramatic." Then she flicked her hand as if swatting away a fly. That sentence sliced straight into my heart. Just cows? To them, a life meant nothing next to their luxury drives, next to the power they believed was absolute. But to me, it was blood and bone, a piece of the life I built, the belief I held on to every day. I looked down at the calf in my arms, its breath fading, its broken legs still twitching in pain. My eyes welled, but the tears evaporated instantly under the fire of my rage. I looked at them and stared straight into their mocking faces. I let them see every ounce of the hatred and contempt I held for them in that moment. Claudia slapped the steering wheel, laughing hard. "You think a few crippled cows are going to stop us? This is our neighborhood. You're just someone who doesn't belong." Beatrice shook her head and added, "You really think these filthy animals matter that much? You've already lost." I said nothing more. Words were useless in the face of such shameless cruelty. I held the calf tight, walked straight into the barn, leaving their laughter ringing behind me. But in my mind, one thought was carved in stone. This fight was no longer just about land. It was about dignity, about defending life itself from those who treated it like nothing. I laid the calf down and wrapped its injury with cloth as a makeshift bandage. I knew it would need a vet immediately. While calling for help, I could still hear the engines roaring outside, the revving so loud it seemed determined to drown everything out. They were still there, waiting for me to explode, waiting for me to lose control so they could twist the story. But I didn't give them that. I stayed silent, though inside, I had already condemned them. The final look I threw in their direction was soaked in hatred, and I saw it for a split second in Claudia's eyes, flicker of unease, even though she tried to hide it. Because they realized my anger wasn't the the rage of a weak man, but the fury of someone ready to strike back. I turned away, and the barn door slammed shut behind me. But the sound wasn't just wood hitting wood, it was a silent promise. They would pay, and the price would be greater than anything they had ever imagined. I knew I couldn't change everything alone, so the village council meeting was my only chance to speak up. I stepped into the small room where the community gathered every month to discuss neighborhood matters. The scent of old wood mixed with weak coffee, fluorescent lights casting their dull glow over familiar faces. I brought with me a folder of land wreck, a few photos showing deep tire tracks in the field, and the injury to the young calf. I stood and spoke. My voice didn't shake, but every word carried the weight of anger and frustration. I described how Claudia and Beatrice had repeatedly driven through my farmland, damaged the soil, and injured my livestock. I presented the evidence, hoping to be heard, but the first response was a dry laugh. A man at the far end of the table leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said mockingly, "It's just a car passing through. No big deal." A woman nearby shrugged and added, "Yeah, you're overreacting. Everyone knows how nice their cars are." The murmurs spread across the room. I heard a few nods of agreement, some muffled chuckles behind sleeves. I felt myself turning into the outsider, the one shouting about something no one wanted to care about. My heart tightened, not because they didn't believe me, but because they were choosing to look away, choosing silence as a shield. At the end of the table, Claudia and Beatrice sat upright, glowing in their bright-colored suit. They didn't need to say much, just a glance between them and a few whispers, loud enough for me to catch. "Who cares about some black farmer?" Beatrice tilted her head and spoke softly but clearly. Claudia smiled, nodded, and let her gaze drift over me like I was an unwanted stain. That sentence echoed in my head like a cold bell. It stripped away any illusion that they saw me as an equal member of the community. To them, I was an outsider, a measuring stick they used to lift themselves up by comparison. There was no need to hide their contempt. They showed it in full view because they believed no one would dare speak against them. I looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic glance. What I got instead was avoidance. Some stared down at papers, others tapped fingers on the table, and a few fixed their gaze on the window. That silence harder than any rejection. I understood they feared the power of the Wellington name. They feared becoming the next target if they dared to speak. My heart pounded, breath heavy, but my voice remained firm. I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want respect. This is my land, and I have the right to defend it. If destroying it is something you see as minor, then tomorrow it'll be your land next. I tapped the folder against the table. The dry thud through the thick silence. Claudia chuckled, the sound like a needle pricking the skin. She threw her arm around Beatrice's shoulder, her voice syrupy and sharp. "Did you hear that? He's teaching the whole community about right. How touching." A few small laughs followed, not loud, but deep enough to drive the humiliation further in. I sat down, no longer searching the room for agreement. I realized I now stood on a separate front line. They had the council, the HOA, the power of money, and a chorus of nodding heads. All I had was the truth and the fury boiling in my chest. Claudia and Beatrice, I knew I couldn't change everything alone, so the village council meeting was my only chance to speak up. I stepped into the small room where the community gathered every month to discuss neighborhood matters. The scent of old wood mixed with weak coffee, fluorescent lights casting their dull glow over familiar faces. I brought with me a folder of land wreck, a few photos showing deep tire tracks in the field, and the injury to the young calf. I stood and spoke. My voice didn't shake, but every word carried the weight of anger and frustration. I described how Claudia and Beatrice had repeatedly driven through my farmland, damaged the soil, and injured my livestock. I presented the evidence, hoping to be heard, but the first response was a dry laugh. A man at the far end of the table leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said mockingly, "It's just a car passing through. No big deal." A woman nearby shrugged and added, "Yeah, you're overreacting. Everyone knows how nice their cars are." The murmurs spread across the room. I heard a few nods of agreement, some muffled chuckles behind sleeves. I felt myself turning into the outsider, the one shouting about something no one wanted to care about. My heart tightened, not because they didn't believe me, but because they were choosing to look away, choosing silence as a shield. At the end of the table, Claudia and that day, I saw headlights flash again at the end of the dirt road. Claudia and Beatrice had no intention of stopping their disgraceful game. They sped through, tires screeching across the wet ground, deliberately swerving to send a wave of mud flying at me. I didn't flint. I stood still and let it hit. Their laughter tore through the wind, crude and gleeful. What I didn't know was that just beyond the fence, a neighbor had quietly raised a phone and recorded the entire scene. A few hours later, that video surfaced on social media. The first line that accompanied it read, "Karen's sisters humiliate black farmer." Just those few words were enough to spark a storm. I sat in front of the screen, watching myself covered in mud while the smug, glowing faces of Claudia and Beatrice lit up under the Sunday. The uploader left no name, only one sentence. "This is the real face of the Lakeside HOA." Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Comments poured in like crashing waves. Some mocked me. He could have stepped aside. Serves him right. Others came to my defense. "This is straight straight up humiliation, completely unacceptable. The reaction split down the middle, half cheering for wealth and status, the other half outraged by such raw injustice. My phone buzzed nonstop. Strangers sent messages, some urging me to stay strong, others expressing their anger on my behalf. I read each line, my emotions tangled. I was used to cold silence at council meetings, so reading messages of support from the outside world jolted something in me. Not everyone had turned away. Somewhere out there, people were watching, and they understood that I was being crushed. Meanwhile, Claudia and Beatrice treated it like entertainment. They showed up at a party, wine glasses in hand, proudly playing the video like it was a trophy. Claudia threw her head back and laughed. The more viral the better. We've got clout now. Beatrice nodded, her voice sharp and cheery. See? Now the whole town knows who the Wellingtons are. Their laughter echoed through the brightly lit room, without a trace of regret, fear. I heard those words secondhand, but every sentence felt like a knife to the chest. To them, this wasn't evidence of guilt, it was a weapon of display. They believed their wealth and HOA title would shield them, that no one could touch them. And that blind confidence only made them bolder, nastier. I won't deny that when I first saw the video spreading, there was a flicker of satisfaction. It was like the first blade scraping across the wall of arrogance they had built. But that satisfaction quickly gave way to caution. I knew Claudia and Beatrice weren't the kind to retreat. For them, exposure wasn't a fall, it was an opening to strike back, and I braced myself for the storm that was coming. The whole neighborhood was talking. People looked at me differently when we passed on the street. Some avoided eye contact, afraid of being dragged into it. Some smiled, nodded slightly, quiet signal of support. But there were also eyes that narrowed, full of judgment and disdain, revealing the clear fracture running through the community. I wasn't surprised. The video had exposed two things: the truth about the Wellingtons and the cowardice of the people around them. Claudia didn't stay silent. She walked into the next HOA meeting with a glowing smile. "It's ridiculous," she began, "that some people would use an internet joke as an excuse to attack us, but everyone knows the truth isn't in edited video." Beatrice followed up, voice laced with sarcasm. "He should thank us. That video made him more famous than his little backwoods farm ever could." A few loyal members chuckled along, adding fuel to their smug performance. I sat there in silence, watching every face. Some eyes wavered, but no one spoke up. I understood this wasn't the moment to strike back. The video was only the spark. I needed time for that spark to turn into flame, to burn down the wall of power Claudia and Beatrice believed was untouchable. That night, sitting alone, I watched the video again. I saw myself in that frame, covered in mud, but still standing, never lowering my head. I realized that might be what people watching, not the humiliation I endured, but the way I didn't step back. And that, I knew, would be the tool I used to shift the balance. Claudia and Beatrice believed the public gaze would side with, but that video proved the opposite. They could mock, they could dismiss it with a wave, but they couldn't stop the truth from spreading. And once truth reaches the hearts of strangers, their manufactured power becomes nothing but a hollow shell. I shut off the screen and breathed deep. In the darkness, I saw it clearer than ever. This wasn't just a fight between me and two arrogant bullies. This was a fight to prove that justice can't be buried beneath the mud they so gladly threw on me. I knew I couldn't let the path through my farmland turning into a public road for the Wellingtons to flaunt themselves. One morning, I built a simple wooden fence, just enough to remind everyone that this was private land, and no one had the right to trespass. The planks were old, but sturdy enough to block the way, with a clear sign staked into the ground. Private property. As I drove it into the earth, felt like I was redrawing the line where my dignity began. Before I could finish, the familiar roar of an engine tore through the air. Claudia and Beatrice came barreling down the road, as if no warning meant anything. I stood to the side, watching, my heart pounding. They didn't slow down. They had no intention of stopping. Instead, they hit the gas harder. The Maserati crashed straight into the fence, wood splintering in every direction. I heard their laughter from inside the car, shrill, mocking, triumphant. Claudia rolled down the window and shouted, "What a maniac farmer. You think a bunch of rotten sticks can stop the Wellingtons?" I stood frozen, staring at the broken fence. My effort had been reduced to a joke in seconds. They weren't just trying to humiliate me. They were turning my attempt to defend my land into proof of their own mockery. Worse still, they had come prepared to capture it. I saw the blinking red light of Beatrice's phone as she filmed everything from the passenger seat. The next day, the video appeared online, but not the real version. They had cut out the part where I built the fence, leaving only the shot of the Maserati smashing through and my voice shouting in the chaos. Beneath the clip, the caption read like a punchline, "Watch us teach the farmer a lesson." They turned me into a roadblock, a joke for the online crowd to laugh at. My rage flared as I read the comment. "This guy's insane, building fences in the middle of the road like he owns the place. This farmer's dangerous, needs to be dealt with. People like that don't belong in this neighborhood." Cold, cruel words piled up, turning me into a target for public scorn. Worse still, fake accounts began began spreading lies, saying I had threatened neighbors, that I had charged at their cars with tools in hand. They slapped labels on me: dangerous, unhinged. Some posts even compared me to a troublemaker who had been arrested in another town. Each fabricated line was another blade digging into my pride, and it became clear Claudia and Beatrice didn't just want to mock me. They wanted to destroy my reputation entirely. Walking down the street, I saw the shift in my neighbors' eyes. Some avoided me, others whispered as I passed. I was no longer the quiet farmer living beside the fields. In their eyes, I had become the maniac farmer, just like the Wellingtons had branded me. I could feel the entire community being pulled into a spiral of deception, and the truth, slowly, was beginning to disappear. But even in that darkness, there were flickers of light. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from strangers, from places I'd never even been. Some simply said, "Don't give up, you're right." Others sent detailed breakdowns, pointing out that Claudia and Beatrice's video had clearly been edited. One woman shared how she used to live next door to them, and had been pushed out, forced to sell her home below market value. A man from another state wrote, "I see myself in your story. Don't let them win." Those words snapped something awake in me. The smear video hadn't just made me a villain, it had accidentally exposed the Wellingtons' true nature for the world to see. Every message was a reminder that truth still carried weight, that I wasn't alone. And from that realization, a new determination took root in me. I knew Claudia and Beatrice would keep going. Crueler tricks were still ahead. But I also understood that every move they made became another piece of evidence against them. If they wanted to turn me into a joke, I would turn their laughter into a public indictment. And one day, all those who laughed with them would fall silent when the truth finally came to light. I stood on the porch, staring down the dirt road etched with tire tracks. Each mark reminded me that this fight was far from over. They could knock down fences, but not the will behind them. They could twist the truth, but they couldn't stop justice from arriving in the end. And I knew that when that day came, the Wellington sisters would learn exactly what it meant to pay the real price. After days of being smeared by an edited clip, I thought I would be stuck with the shame for a long time. But life has a way of turning things around. One evening, I got a message from a stranger. "Check this channel, they're telling the truth." I clicked the link, my heart racing as I saw the headline glowing on a major social commentary platform. The host appeared with a calm but sharp voice. They replayed the video that Claudia and Beatrice had posted, then froze the frame. "Right here," he said, pointing out a sudden cut. "We don't see the farmer building the fence, but if you look closely, the ground behind shows broken wood, clear signs that there was a barrier." This clip was clearly edited. He zoomed in on the blinking red light from Beatrice's phone, proving the footage was staged. Each detail was exposed. The analysis was cool and clinical. Viewers flooded the live chat with comments. "Straight up dirty setup. They act like they're untouchable. Wellingtons think they're royalty or something." I sat watching, a surge of satisfaction rising in my chest. Finally, truth was out. They weren't laughing anymore. They had become the punchline. Right after that, social media exploded. The hashtag number "no tresting" popped up, originally a joke on the no trespassing sign I had put up, quickly turned into a movement. Thousands shared the story, posted memes of the luxury Maserati stuck in the mud with the caption, "No tres." People used it to call out wealthy abuse of power, to tell their own stories of being ignored or stomped on by HOAs or moneyed elite. What started as a small neighborhood incident became a symbol of resistance. Claudia and Beatrice didn't take it quietly. At a gathering with close friends, they lashed out, voices sharp with rage. "Those bastards don't know who we are," Claudia shouted, slamming her wineglass onto the table, eyes blazing. Beatrice tried to calm her, but her voice trembled too. "We need to take our name back. We can't let those people control the story." But I knew whatever honor they believed they had was already buried in the mud the moment that clip was publicly dissected. I didn't have to say much. I just smiled when I heard the news. In my mind, I thought, you dug your own grave. They had trusted too much in the protection of money and the Wellington name, never expecting that arrogance itself would become the evidence against them. Every word they spoke, every move they made, every smug laugh captured, analyzed, ridiculed. What they treated as entertainment had become a blade turning back on them. That reversal didn't just bring me vindication, it showed me the unexpected power of the online community. When people see the raw truth, when the voice of the powerless is amplified, even the most arrogant systems start to shake. I received more messages than ever, not just a few scattered lines of sympathy, but bold words of support, voices urging me to stand tall. Someone wrote, "You're not just protecting land, you're protecting dignity for the rest of us." Another woman sent a photo of the house she had been forced to sell under HOA pressure, with a note that said, "Because of your story, I finally had the courage to talk about that shame." I read every line, my heart heavy but lit with renewed belief. I understood now that this fight was no longer just mine. Meanwhile, Claudia and Beatrice were growing more unsteady. They called a closed meeting with the HOA board, looking for ways to strike back. Some advised them to stay quiet, let the storm pass. But Claudia snapped, "I'm a Wellington. That name never gets dragged through the mud." Beatrice nodded, echoing her, but there was fear in her eyes. They no longer looked like the confident ones, they looked like cornered animals. The whole neighborhood started whispering. Before, people had kept their distance, afraid to speak. Now, things were changing. A few began to quietly express support. support. Some even shared screenshots of threatening messages from the HOA, proof of the abuse of power. I realized true strength didn't lie in a luxury car or a bright suit, it lay in the truth once it was uncovered. I sat on the porch, looking down the dirt road. The tire marks were still there, but this time, they didn't look like scars. They looked like proof of pride, unraveling. Each rut in the soil was a reminder that the battle had turned, that I was no longer standing alone, and I knew this was only the beginning. They would strike back again, would try every tactic they had, but I wasn't alone anymore. I had allies now, not just from the neighborhood, but from strangers across the country. It gave me satisfaction. It wasn't just their humiliation, it was that justice had finally found its voice. Do you believe social media can be a weapon for justice, or does it only make things worse? That morning, the sky was clear. Sunlight filtered through every branch. And it was a day that should have begun in peace, with the usual work. I was stacking a few bundles of hay for the cattle when the familiar sound of an engine pierced the air. That sound cut like a blade into my ears, announcing the arrival of two people I had no desire to see. Claudia and Beatrice Wellington. The white Maserati veered close to the edge of the field, avoiding the dirt path they normally took. This time, they deliberately steered toward the livestock pen. I heard tires grinding against the hardened soil, grass blades flung into the air, then the panicked bellowing of the cattle, a few of them startled and scattered in all directions. The chaotic noise from the pen felt like it was ripping my chest open. Amid the commotion, I heard a painful cry. A young calf had been knocked down, its front leg caught between two wooden slats. It thrashed in panic, eyes wide and glossy with fear. I rushed over, pushing aside tangled hay and broken boards, my heartbeat slamming with dread. I placed my hand on its body and felt the tremble in that tiny frame. Its leg was twisted, horribly broken, its breath short and jagged, mixed with strangled cries. My whole body shook, not with fear, but with rage. The blood in my veins boiled, every breath a knife slicing through my chest. I lifted the calf out of the trap, trying to hold it steady in my arms. Its eyes met mine, pleading, as if I were the only thing left that could protect it. I spun toward the two cars. They had stopped right in front of the pen, windows down, laughter spilling out. I shouted, the sound bursting out like a roar. "Do you have any conscience left?" My voice echoed across the open space, raw with fury, stripped of all restraint. Claudia raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a bitter smile. Beatrice crossed her arms, her voice sharp as a blade sliding across glass. "Oh, please, they're just cows. Don't be so dramatic." Then she flicked her hand as if swatting away a fly. That sentence sliced straight into my heart. Just cows? To them, a life meant nothing next to their luxury drives, next to the power they believed was absolute. But to me, it was blood and bone, a piece of the life I built, the belief I held on to every day. I looked down at the calf in my arms, its breath fading, its broken legs still twitching in pain. My eyes welled, but the tears evaporated instantly under the fire of my rage. I looked at them and stared straight into their mocking faces. I let them see every ounce of the hatred and contempt I held for them in that moment. Claudia slapped the steering wheel, laughing hard. "You think a few crippled cows are going to stop us? This is our neighborhood. You're just someone who doesn't belong." Beatrice shook her head and added, "You really think these filthy animals matter that much? You've already lost." I said nothing more. Words were useless in the face of such shameless cruelty. I held the calf tight, walked straight into the barn, leaving their laughter ringing behind me. But in my mind, one thought was carved in stone. This fight was no longer just about land. It was about dignity, about defending life itself from those who treated it like nothing. I laid the calf down and wrapped its injury with cloth as a makeshift bandage. I knew it would need a vet immediately. While calling for help, I could still hear the engines roaring outside, the revving so loud it seemed determined to drown everything out. They were still there, waiting for me to explode, waiting for me to lose control so they could twist the story. But I didn't give them that. I stayed silent, though inside, I had already condemned them. The final look I threw in their direction was soaked in hatred, and I saw it just for a split second in Claudia's eyes. A flicker of unease, even though she tried to hide it. Because they realized my anger wasn't the rage of a weak man, but the fury of someone ready to strike back. I turned away, and the barn door slammed shut behind me. But the sound wasn't just wood hitting wood, it was a silent promise. They would pay, and the price would be greater than anything they had ever imagined. After the explosive meeting, I knew without a doubt that Claudia and Beatrice wouldn't stop. Their threats still echoed in my head, but instead of fear, I felt more determined than ever. If they believed money could crush me, then I would prove that the land held a power far greater, and to do that, I needed a plan. I sat down and mapped out every step. They had grown used to driving through my field, gloating as their tires sprayed mud at others. So the very mud would become the verdict against them. I picked a low, damp patch of field right next to the path Claudia and Beatrice often took. It sat lower than the surrounding ground, and after rain, small puddles always formed there. I realized it was the perfect weak point to turn into a trap. The following night, I called on a few trusted neighbors. Not everyone dared to openly oppose the Wellingtons, but there were still those who quietly supported me, people who had also been pushed down by the HOA, forced to stay silent just to survive. They came quietly, bringing shovels, flashlights, and a quiet resolve. We dug in silence, shovel after shovel breaking into the earth. The ground was soft, and each layer of soil lifted felt like another layer of anger released. No one said much, but when our eyes met in the dark, it was clear we all wanted to see the Wellingtons taste humiliation. I remember the sweat running down my face, mixing with the scent of wet earth, and I knew I was no longer alone. After a few hours, the pit was deep enough to trap any vehicle bold enough to cross it. I crouched down to check every edge, making sure nothing looked suspicious. Over the surface, I laid a layer of dry straw, then spread a thin coat of dirt on top to hide it. From a distance, it looked like any normal patch of road, maybe even drier than the others, but I knew that with one reckless press of the gas, the entire car would sink. When the work was done, we sat by the edge of the field, catching our breath. One neighbor clapped me on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "It's time. They need to learn to respect this." I nodded, saying nothing. Inside me was a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. This wasn't just a physical trap, it was the answer to every jeer and insult Claudia and Beatrice had ever hurled. That night, I lay awake, unable to sleep. Images came one by one: the calf with the broken leg, the mocking laughter at the village meeting, the hateful comments online. It felt like I was packing the entire rage of the community into that pit of mud. It wasn't just a personal scheme, it was justice, handed down by the land itself. Before sunrise, I walked the road one last time, checking every detail. The straw covered it cleanly, every sign of digging wiped away. I sat down, running my fingers through the dry straw, feeling the cold dampness of the mud below. In my heart, I whispered, "Tomorrow, justice will reveal itself." The sound of insects chirping rose steadily, like an overture to the confrontation about to unfold. I lifted my head, watching the night sky slowly brighten. In that moment, I no longer felt like a trampled victim, but the one holding the scales, ready to place the Wellingtons on one side and measure the cost of their arrogance. On the walk back to my house, I felt a small part of the weight lift. I knew the battle was far from over, that they would never bow easily. But now, I had a weapon of my own, and nothing felt more satisfying than using the very land they disdained to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. That night, I sat alone on the porch step, the dim light from the bulb above casting faint shadows across the dried streaks of mud, still clinging to my boots. After a day of digging and laying the trap, my body ached, but my mind was oddly clear. I whispered softly, just loud enough for myself to hear, "Tomorrow, justice will reveal itself." The words hung in the still air, like a vow seared into my heart. The chirping from the fields came back louder, insistent, like war drums echoing at the start of the play I had just written. They sounded like a reminder that everything was in place, that the earth itself was eager to witness the moment of reckoning. I looked out over the familiar dirt path, imagining the white Maserati speeding toward it, the screech of tires as it hit the mud, and the shocked faces of Claudia and Beatrice. The thought alone sent a wave of satisfaction through me that I hadn't felt in months. I didn't sleep that night, only dozed off in short bursts before jolting awake. Crickets, the wind rustling through the trees, they all sounded like a background score, preparing for justice to make its entrance. When dawn broke and the soft pink light spread across the fields, I stood, stretched, a mix of tension and resolve tightening every muscle. I knew today would be different. All morning, I pretended to work as usual, cutting grass, checking the fence, feeding the cattle, but inside, every heartbeat was a countdown. I waited for the sound of the engine, familiar roar that had once filled me with rage. The sun climbed higher, heat rising, sweat gathering on my brow, but I stayed there, eyes fixed on the entrance of the neighborhood. Then it came. The rumble of the car carried across the fields, loud and proud like a trumpet announcing invading troop. I saw the white Maserati gleaming in the sunlight, racing straight for the field. Claudia was at the wheel, sunglasses hiding half her face, while Beatrice leaned in with a smirk, holding up her phone like she was ready to record another humiliating video. I stood at the edge of the path, pretending to be indifferent, holding a bucket of water for the cattle, but every muscle was tight, waiting for the moment. The car drew drew closer, music blasting from inside, drowning out the bird. They had no clue. They didn't notice the road they thought they knew had already changed beneath my hand. In a split second, the front right tire plunged into the disguised mud pit. A sharp, cracking sound echoed as the car jerked to a stop, its body trembling violently. Claudia panicked, twisting the steering wheel, but the more she turned, the deeper the tire sank. Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill. What the hell is happening? I saw the phone in her hand shaking wildly, the image on the screen no longer a mocking spectacle but a nightmare of mud swallowing their luxury car. Claudia slammed the gas pedal. The engine roared, smoke billowed thick into the air, but it was useless. The mud was like a giant hand, slowly pulling the Maserati under. The rear tires began to sink. Soil and water splattered across the body, covering the glossy white paint. The screeching engine now sounded more like a desperate cry for help. I remained where I was, eyes locked on the scene. Steam rose from the pit, the stench of rubber mingling with the damp, earthy air, forming a strange symphony of satisfaction. I felt no shame, no humiliation, only a cold, steady pride. I allowed myself faintest smirk, whispering, "The land has answered for me." Beatrice's scream rang out, frantic and broken. "Claudia, get it out, pull it out now." Claudia's jaw clenched, both hands white, knuckled on the wheel, her face drained of color. I saw sweat gathering at her temples, fear overtaking her eyes. For the first time, I saw the Wellingtons not as arrogant rulers, but as prey, being buried by the very ground they had disrespected. Mud flew in globs, splashing across their pastel suits, blotching the car from hood to trunk. I heard neighbors beginning to gather, murmurs rising, a few stifled chuckles escaping. Those who once stayed silent now appeared, watching from behind the fences. They no longer hid their satisfaction. Some even raised their phone, capturing the moment Claudia and Beatrice's precious car sank deeper into the pit. I turned to look at them, saying nothing. My gaze was enough to make the message clear. Justice does not always require a courtroom or a jury. Sometimes all it takes is the right patch of mud. And now, the very two who spat on my dignity, who scoffed at life itself, were receiving their most expensive lesson yet. In that moment, I no longer saw myself as the oppressed. I was the witness to arrogance collapsing. I knew this was only the beginning, that the Wellingtons would try to strike back, that the war wasn't over. But at least today, I showed them that money cannot rescue a car once it's sunk in the mud. I walked back into the house, leaving behind the screams and the engine's futile roar. Inside me, a strange calm spread. Justice had arrived, and it needed no defense. After the explosive meeting, I knew without a doubt that Claudia and Beatrice wouldn't stop. Their threats still echoed in my head, but instead of fear, I felt more determined than ever. If they believed money could crush me, then I would prove that the land held a power far greater, and to do that, I needed a plan. I sat down and mapped out every step. They had grown used to driving through my field, gloating as their tires sprayed mud at others, so the very mud would become the verdict against them. I picked a low, damp patch of field right next to the path Claudia and Beatrice often took. It sat lower than the surrounding ground, and after rain, small puddles always formed there. I realized it was the perfect weak point to turn into a trap. The following night, I called on a few trusted neighbors. Not everyone dared to openly oppose the Wellingtons, but there were still those who quietly supported me, people who had also been pushed down by the HOA, forced to stay silent to survive. They came quietly, bringing shovels, flashlights, and a quiet resolve. We dug in silence, shovel after shovel breaking into the earth. The ground was soft, and each layer of soil lifted felt like another layer of anger released. No one said much, but when our eyes met in the dark, it was clear we all wanted to see the Wellingtons taste humiliation. I remember the sweat running down my face, mixing with the scent of wet earth, and I knew I was no longer alone. After a few hours, the pit was deep enough to trap any vehicle bold enough to cross it. Crouched down to check every edge, making sure nothing looked suspicious. Over the surface, I laid a layer of dry straw, then spread a thin coat of dirt on top to hide it. From a distance, it looked like any normal patch of road, maybe even drier than the other. But I knew that with one reckless press of the gas, the entire car would sink. When the work was done, we sat by the edge of the field, catching our breath. One neighbor clapped me on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "It's time. They need to learn to respect this place." I nodded, saying nothing. Inside me was a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. This wasn't just a physical trap, it was the answer to every jeer and insult Claudia and Beatrice had ever hurled. That night, I lay awake, unable to sleep. Images came one by one: the calf with the broken leg, the mocking laughter at the village meeting, the hateful comments online. It felt like I was packing the entire rage of the community into that pit of mud. It wasn't just a personal scheme, it was justice, handed down by the land itself. Before sunrise, I walked the road one last time, checking every detail. The straw covered it cleanly, every sign of digging wiped away. I sat down, running my fingers through the dry straw, feeling the cold dampness of the mud below. In my heart I whispered, "Tomorrow, justice will reveal itself." The sound of insects chirping rose steadily, like an overture to the confrontation about to unfold. I lifted my head, watching the night sky slowly brighten. In that moment, I no longer felt like a trampled victim, but the one holding the scales, ready to place the Wellingtons on one side and measure the cost of their arrogance. On the walk back to my house, I felt a small part of the weight lift. I knew the battle was far from over, that they would never bow easily, but now I had a weapon of my own. And nothing felt more satisfying than using the very land they disdained to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. That night, I sat alone on the porch steps, the dim light from the bulb above casting faint shadows across the dried streaks of mud, still clinging to my boots. After a day of digging and laying the trap, my body ached, but my mind was oddly clear. I whispered softly, just loud enough for myself to hear, "Tomorrow, justice will reveal itself." The words hung in the still air like a vow seared into my heart. The chirping from the fields came back louder, insistent, like war drums echoing at the start of the play I had just written. They sounded like a reminder that everything was in place, that the earth itself was eager to witness the moment of reckoning. I looked out over the familiar dirt path, imagining the white Maserati speeding toward it, the screech of tires as it hit the mud, and the shocked faces of Claudia and Beatrice. The thought alone sent a wave of satisfaction through me that I hadn't felt in months. I didn't sleep that night, only dozed off in short bursts before jolting awake. The cricket, the wind rustling through the trees, they all sounded like a background score preparing for justice to make its entrance. When dawn broke and the soft pink light spread across the fields, I stood, stretched, a mix of tension and resolve tightening every muscle. I knew today would be different. All morning, I pretended to work as usual, cutting grass, checking the fence, feeding the cattle, but inside, every heartbeat was a countdown. I waited for the sound of the engine, the familiar roar that had once filled me with rage. The sun climbed higher, heat rising, sweat gathering on my brow, but I stayed there, eyes fixed on the entrance of the neighborhood. Then it came. The rumble of the car carried across the fields, loud and proud like a trumpet announcing invading troop. I saw the white Maserati gleaming in the sunlight, racing straight for the field. Claudia was at the wheel, sunglasses hiding half her face, while Beatrice leaned in with a smirk, holding up phone like she was ready to record another humiliating video. I stood at the edge of the path, pretending to be indifferent, holding a bucket of water for the cattle, but every muscle was tight, waiting for the moment. The car drew closer, music blasting from inside, drowning out the bird. They had no clue. They didn't notice the road they thought they knew had already changed beneath my hand. In a split second, front right tire plunged into the disguised mud pit. A sharp cracking sound echoed as the car jerked to a stop, its body trembling violently. Claudia panicked, twisting the steering wheel, but the more she turned, the deeper the tire sank. Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill. "What the hell is happening?" I saw the phone in her hand shaking wildly, the image on the screen no longer a mocking spectacle but a nightmare of mud swallowing their luxury car. Claudia slammed the gas pedal, the engine roared, smoke billowed thick into the air, but it was useless. The mud was like a giant hand, slowly pulling the Maserati under. The rear tires began to sink. Soil and water splattered across the body, covering the glossy white paint. The screeching engine now sounded more like a desperate cry for help. I remained where I was, eyes locked on the scene. Steam rose from the pit, the stench of rubber mingling with the damp, earthy air, forming a strange symphony of satisfaction. I felt no shame, no humiliation, only a cold, steady pride. I allowed myself the faintest smirk, whispering, "The land has answered for me." Beatrice's scream rang out, frantic and broken. "Claudia, get it out! Pull it out now!" Claudia's jaw clenched, both hands white, knuckled on the wheel. Her face drained of color. I saw sweat gathering at her temples, fear overtaking her eyes. For the first time, I saw the Wellingtons not as arrogant rulers, but as prey, being buried by the very ground they had disrespected. Mud flew in globs, splashing across their pastel suits, blotching the car from hood to trunk. I heard neighbors beginning to gather, murmurs rising, few stifled chuckles escaping. Those who once stayed silent now appeared, watching from behind the fences. They no longer hid their satisfaction. Some even raised their phones, capturing the moment Claudia and Beatrice's precious car sank deeper into the... I turned to look at them, saying nothing. My gaze was enough to make the message clear. Justice does not always require a courtroom or a jury. Sometimes all it takes is the right patch of mud. And now, the very two who spat on my dignity, who scoffed at life itself, were receiving their most expensive lesson yet. In that moment, I no longer saw myself as the oppressed. I was the witness to arrogance collapsing. I knew this was only the beginning, that the Wellingtons would try to strike back, that the war wasn't over. But at least today, I showed them that money cannot rescue a car once it's sunk in the mud. I walked back into the house, leaving behind the screams and the engine's futile roar. Inside me, a strange calm spread. Justice had arrived, and it needed no defense. I knew the trap was ready, just waiting for the moment of reckoning, and it came faster than I expected. That afternoon, the sound of an engine echoed in the distance, not the old Maserati, but something else, even more ostentatious. Claudia and Beatrice appeared in a gleaming white Lamborghini, blazing under the late sunlight. They wanted to show the whole neighborhood that they were still untouchable, that a few online criticisms weren't enough to make a Wellington bow. The Lamborghini glided in, its exhaust roaring like a beast challenging the sky itself. I stood at the edge of the road, watching. Claudia was behind the wheel, her eyes sharp with determination, while Beatrice held up her phone, ready to film another scene of mockery. I heard her cackle, shrill and venomous. "Watch this. We're going to show the world we're not afraid." And I didn't respond, just tightened my grip on the empty bucket in my hand, eyes fixed on the spinning wheels, rushing toward fate. In that moment, every other sound faded. All that remained was the roar of the engine and the pounding of my heart. And then, exactly as I had planned, it happened. As the Lamborghini surged across the familiar stretch of road, front right tire suddenly dropped. The jolt was violent, and the car's nose slammed into the earth. A loud crunch echoed, followed by the helpless screeching of tires. Mud exploded from beneath the layer of dry straw, splattering across the white car like a slap from the land itself. Claudia clenched her jaw, twisting the wheel with all her strength, but the more she fought, the deeper the wheels sank. I saw the black sludge slowly devouring them, every turn of the tires only churning the earth more violently. Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking. "Drive, Claudia! Don't let those bastards laugh at us." But even she was trembling, her hand flailing as the phone slipped from her grasp, the screen still recording the humiliation in real time. The engine screamed, white smoke pouring out, but it was useless. Their luxury car, prized trophy, now writhed like a trapped animal, flailing in vain. Every burst of acceleration only flung more mud across the windshield, thickening the mess on their pastel suit. The familiar laughter was gone, placed with curses and enraged howl. Neighbors began to gather, whispers growing into chatter that rippled down the street. Some laughed aloud, some held up their phone. I caught the glint of satisfaction in faces that had stayed silent during the town hall. Now, even they couldn't hide their pleasure, watching the Wellingtons being taught a lesson by the land. A man chuckled. "There it is, baby's first mud bath. Let's see how smug they are now." Claudia slammed her hands against the steering wheel, her voice shrill with fury. "He set us up. We'll sue. We'll ruin him for this." Beatrice screamed too, though her voice quivered, her muddy hands fumbling to open the door. They tried to step out, but the mud clung to the tires, swallowing every footstep, turning the pristine Lamborghini into a filthy spectacle, no different than a public joke. I stood there, saying nothing, the corner of my mouth curled into a faint smile. In my mind, the words I once whispered to myself echoed again. Money can't save you when your wheels hit the mud. Now they understood every ounce of arrogance comes with a price. And that price wasn't paid in dollars, but in humiliation, laid bare before the entire community. With each passing minute, the crowd grew larger. Some were live streaming, comments flooding in. "Karma is real. This is justice. She deserved it." Through the muddy glass, I caught a glimpse of Claudia's panicked eyes, an expression I had never seen before. The look of someone finally realizing they weren't invincible. When they stepped out of the car, clothes stained, hair a tangled mess, laughter erupted from the crowd. It wasn't nervous or hesitant anymore. It was the release of long-suppressed satisfaction. I knew then, from this day forward, the name Wellington would no longer be one people bowed to. I turned and walked back into the house, leaving behind the scene of a luxury car caught in a trap, and two prideful figures flailing in vain. The months of anger within me had settled into calm, because I understood the land had answered for me, and justice had truly revealed itself. Claudia and Beatrice's screams echoed across the fields as the Lamborghini's wheels sank deeper into the mud. They thrashed helplessly, their once elegant clothes now tattered, soaked in filth, makeup smeared, hair wild, every trace of former grandeur erased. They screamed, pointed at me, as if I were the one responsible for their world crumbling to pieces. I stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with quiet detachment. A smile flickered, not malice, but the unmistakable sense that justice had spoken. "This," I said clearly, "for them and every neighbor within earshot, is the land answering you." The words dropped like stone, stirring a wave through the crowd. Beatrice struggled to open the door and step down, only to slip straight into the mud, her dress soaked as her legs sank nearly to the knees. Laughter broke from neighbors behind the fence. Someone raised a phone to capture it, their voice cutting through the breeze. "That's karma. What good is a fancy car if it's just metal sinking in mud?" Their words only pushed Claudia and Beatrice further into rage. Claudia tried to salvage dignity, shouting for a tow truck. Minutes later, an emergency vehicle arrived, revved up, and hooked onto the car. But when the driver hit the gas, even the tow truck's wheels sank into the same pit we had dug. He cursed loudly, slammed the steering wheel, powerless against the swampy earth. The crowd burst into laughter, loud, unrestrained, echoing down the street. Humiliation was now complete, undeniable. Beatrice screamed, "How dare you laugh at us? We are the Wellingtons." But the shout only fueled the crowd's scorn. A woman's voice called from behind, "Wellington means nothing now, it's a punchline." That single sentence sparked a cascade of bitter, knowing laughter. I sat atop the fence, watching the entire scene unfold. The wind carried the scent of mud and burnt engine, merging into a thick stench of failure. In my eyes, this wasn't just a luxury car caught in a trap, it was a public reckoning, long overdue, for arrogance left unchecked. Claudia looked around and saw the phone recording. Her face went pale, eyes wide with panic. She lunged toward a neighbor, trying to snatch the phone from their hands, but was pushed back. The person shouted, "You can't cover up the truth." Voices rose in unison, like a verdict handed down by the entire community. On social media, the clips surfaced within minutes. Footage of the white Lamborghini sinking in the mud, the Wellington sisters drenched and screaming, amid waves of ridicule. Comments flooded in, "Karma served. She had it coming. This is justice." I read every line, feeling a satisfaction seep deep into my bones. I didn't need to speak. The community had spoken for me. Claudia and Beatrice eventually dragged themselves out of the pit, their bodies caked in thick mud, their clothes unrecognizable. They trembled, eyes bloodshot, yet still managed to scream, "We'll sue. We won't let you get away with this." I simply looked at them and replied calmly, "There wouldn't be a trap if you hadn't trespassed." And the crowd erupted in applause, a long round of clapping that echoed like a bell tolling the end of their arrogance. I felt light, not because of a personal victory, but because the truth had finally been witnessed and remembered. When the tow finally managed to haul the car out, the Lamborghini was nothing more than a filthy heap of metal, its former glory gone. Claudia and Beatrice sat slumped by the roadside, gasping for breath, their eyes vacant. I walked away, leaving the scene behind. Inside, peace returned, because I knew justice had made itself clear today. No court needed, no judgment, but the undeniable truth, laid bare in the middle of this land. Claudia trembled as she dialed for roadside assistance, her voice screaming into the phone like a desperate woman clinging to a blade of grass. Minutes later, the emergency tow truck arrived, its red paint glaring against the muddy backdrop. The driver stepped down, full of confidence, motioned for me to step back, and declared, "5 minutes, I'll have them out." I folded my arms and said nothing, quietly watching. The tow cable latched onto the Lamborghini's rear frame, and the truck's engine roared. Its front wheels inched forward, then squealed. But within seconds, confident roar turned into a strained whine. The tow truck's wheels began to sink, sucked into the slop like everything else. The driver's eyes bulged as he slammed the steering wheel and cursed loudly. The crowd gasped, then burst into uncontrollable laughter. Claudia clutched her head and screamed, while Beatrice collapsed onto the grass, clothes caked in mud, eyes red and swollen. The Wellington sisters had never faced such humiliation. They had once boasted that money could buy anything. Yet today, both the Lamborghini and the tow truck were swallowed by mud, turned into a public joke under the midday Sunday. Onlookers crowded the scene. Dozens of phones were raised high, lights flashing as videos rolled. I heard voices between bursts of laughter. "This better go viral. Karma in act. They had it coming." Each word landed like an arrow, transforming panic into public disgrace. Within hours, the clips flooded social media. I opened my phone to see hundreds of shares and comments pouring in. Someone edited a photo of the Lamborghini half submerged in mud with the caption, "Justice from the earth." Others added goofy music, turning Claudia's flailing into farce. People who had once remained silent now poured out their outrage at Wellington's arrogance. I read the comments. Some made me chuckle. "Those wheels cost more than my house and couldn't beat mud. Money can buy an HOA but not gravity." But others struck deeper. "This proves truth can't be buried." That farmer did what the whole silent community was too afraid to do. The more Claudia and Beatrice screamed, the more ridiculous they looked. They lunged at people filming, only prompting more cameras to riot. A young man shouted, "You can't hide the truth." Applause erupted, louder than the growling engine. I sat on the fence and watched it all. I didn't need to act, didn't need to say a word. Their panic and rage spoke for themselves. The earth didn't just trap their wheels, it stripped away their pride. And when the truth is captured by hundreds of phones, no amount of power can cover it up. In that moment, I felt an uncanny calm. I was no longer the humiliated, no longer the muddied victim. I was the witness to justice arriving in its simplest form from the dirt, from the truth that refuses to stay buried. And I knew this was only the beginning of the long unraveling that Claudia and Beatrice would have to face. I sat quietly on the fence, watching the chaos unfold before me. Claudia and Beatrice were caked in mud, screaming in desperation. Phones remained raised, live streams rolling, each comment cutting sharp and fast. Karma served. She had it coming. I knew this moment would live on the internet forever, untouchable by money or power. But I also understood this wasn't the end. The crowd swelled, laughter and chatter rising until members of the HOA felt forced to call the police. Moments later, a patrol car pulled up. Red and blue lights swept across the field, lighting the muddy ground with a tense, fluorescent glare. 2 officers stepped out, one heading toward me, the other toward Claudia and Beatrice. Claudia rushed forward, screaming like someone clinging to a lifeline. "He set us up! He tried to kill us! Arrest him now!" Beatrice followed, her hand trembling as she pointed straight at me. "That's right, he dug a mud trap. He wanted to hurt us." I didn't react immediately. I calmly reached into my pocket and handed the officer my land document. Here's proof of ownership. This land belongs to me. It's not public. They've trespassed repeatedly despite the posted sign. I didn't set a trap. I was preparing the land for cultivation. My voice was steady, each word deliberate. The officer flipped through the paperwork and nodded slowly. Partner scanned the scene, eyes landing on the surrounding neighbors. A woman stepped forward and spoke loudly. I've seen them driving through here all the time, ignoring the sign. He's telling the truth, a man added. I recorded a clip. They clearly sped up on purpose. Mud was flying everywhere. Claudia lost it. Her voice cracked as she screamed. You're all traitors. Do you know who we are? Beatrice slammed her hand on the now muddy hood of the Lamborghini and shouted, We're the Wellingtons. We run this place. But this time, their declarations only drew laughter from the crowd, a heavy-handed verdict cloaked in mockery. One of the officers turned back to me and asked, Do you have anything to prove you didn't deliberately set them up? I pointed at the private property sign, still standing just a few meters away, and said clearly, the warning was posted. The boundaries were marked. If they hadn't driven in, nothing would have happened. The air went still for a few seconds. Then the officer gave a firm nod and said, This is private land. Mrs. Wellington, you've trespassed. He's not in violation. The words hit like a direct blow. Claudia's mouth dropped open. Beatrice froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. The crowd erupted in applause. The clapping thundered, drowning out the sister's shriek. Someone yelled, That's karma! Another added, Finally, the law speaks. I remained on the fence, watching it all unfold, a strange calm settling over me. I didn't need to yell or shout because truth had been spoken by the law itself. Claudia continued to thrash, screaming, We'll sue. We'll take him to court. But her voice cracked, lost amid the laughter and the sound of cameras rolling from the crowd. A few people were even live streaming, broadcasting the event to the world. Within minutes, thousands were watching, witnessing the Wellingtons being unmasked. I sighed, not from exhaustion, from relief. Finally, after months of enduring, the law had stood by my side. This was no longer a personal battle. It was a turning point, proof that money and arrogance could no longer trample over justice. I stood up, brushing off the dirt from my clothes, and stared directly at Claudia and Beatrice. Your last name doesn't exempt you from the truth. And this land doesn't belong to the Wellington. It belongs to justice. My voice rang out in the air, final blow cutting through their delusion. The crowd erupted into applause, the cheers reverberating. I turned and walked away, leaving behind the mud-streaked Lamborghini and the broken faces of those who had once thought themselves invincible. Inside, a new chapter had begun, one where Claudia and Beatrice would pay every day for their arrogance. The incident with the Lamborghini sinking into the mud hadn't even cooled before the authorities officially stepped in. The videos spread quickly, accompanied by hundreds of calls for an investigation, forcing their hand. A team of officials and police arrived at my farm early the next morning. They walked along the dirt road, inspecting each tire mark, taking notes meticulously. I stood beside them, clutching the file I had prepared long ago. The lead officer asked, Do you have documents proving the boundary lines? I nodded, opened the stack of notarized papers, and presented every map, every certificate of land ownership. They reviewed each document carefully, comparing it to the markers on the actual terrain. Their eyes showed no suspicion, only confirmation. Meanwhile, Claudia and Beatrice were also present, standing a few steps away. Their faces still showed signs of exhaustion from the humiliating night before, though their voices remained arrogant. Claudia shouted, He set a trap to hurt us. This land was always a shared path. No one has the right to block it. Beatrice echoed, This is illegal. He must pay for what he's done. The officials didn't respond right away. One of them pointed to the private property sign a short distance away and asked, How long has this sign been here? I replied, For months, since they started trespassing. Everyone in the neighborhood has seen it. A few nearby neighbors nodded in agreement, and someone even provided an old photo proving the sign had been there long before. Finally, the lead official closed the file and spoke clearly. The paperwork is valid. This land is legally owned by him. Driving through it is trespassing. The statement landed like a hammer. Claudia's mouth dropped open, and Beatrice stood stunned, her face flushed red. Every word they had shouted moments earlier now seemed utterly meaningless. Claudia tried one last time. But he dug that trap on purpose. He wanted to destroy us. I turned and replied directly, If you hadn't trespassed, there wouldn't have been a trap. Your wheels drove into it on their own. My voice wasn't loud, but each word landed with firmness, causing a moment of silence before whispers resumed in the crowd. The official looked at them and stated firmly, Any accusations must be supported by evidence. What we've seen today only confirms that you have repeatedly trespassed on private land. That's a punishable offense. Claudia's expression darkened, and Beatrice bit her lip, clearly unable to accept the ruling. The gathered neighbors stood in silence, watching. They were used to seeing the Wellingtons win every argument, but today, for the first time, they saw that arrogance silenced by irrefutable legal documents. Some smiled quietly, Others let out a sigh of relief. They realized that truth still held weight, and that no one, not even the Wellingtons, could rise above it. I stood among them, not smug, not boastful. What I felt peace. Because in that moment, justice didn't come from my fury, nor from the crowd's mockery. It came from the law, something Claudia and Beatrice once believed their money could bend. The Wellington sisters looked at each other, eyes burning with fury and helplessness. They couldn't deny, couldn't deflect, only swallow their rage. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was merely the turning point, the beginning of a long reckoning where they'd have to face the raw truth. They were no longer untouchable. I turned away and walked toward the fields. The morning sun shone down, illuminating patches of mud that had yet to dry. Every groove in the earth stood as testimony, a verdict already passed, impossible to erase. And I knew then that the balance had truly shifted in my favor. Claudia and Beatrice refused to accept the truth. When the official read the conclusion that the land was mine, that their actions constituted trespass, the two erupted like people unraveling. Claudia jabbed a finger in my face, her voice shrill and cutting. "He set us up. This was calculated. This was a crime." Beatrice lunged forward, her dress still streaked with mud, eyes bloodshot. "If it wasn't on purpose, why was there a deep pit exactly where we drove? He wants to destroy the Wellington name." I didn't back down, didn't flint. I met their eyes, and replied in a calm, steady voice. "If you hadn't trespassed, there wouldn't have been a trap." A simple answer, sharp as a blade, slicing clean through their screams. For a moment, the crowd went silent. They understood the truth, and so did the sisters, though they couldn't bring themselves to face it. Claudia stomped her heel, Beatrice shouted again, but every word now only made them look more absurd. The louder they became, the more desperate they appeared. Meanwhile, I stood calm at the eye of the storm, still clutching the folder of land ownership document. My silence stood in stark contrast to their hysteria, and in that contrast, the truth was clearer than any evidence. Some neighbors began whispering. One said softly, "He's right, no trespassing, no trap." Another nodded, adding, "It's his land. The warning sign's been there for months. They drove in anyway, and now they cry foul." Their murmurs cut straight through the Wellington's pride like a knife. The official shook his head and jotted down a few more notes. One of them spoke up. "The act of trespassing on private property is clear. As for the so-called trap, we see no evidence that he deliberately created one. This is low-ground, muddy terrain, something anyone can observe." His voice was even, impartial, but the confirmation was enough to silence any remaining argument. Claudia covered her face and hissed gritted teeth, "You'll all regret this. Wellington never loses." Beatrice stared down, eyes blazing, but no words came. Every sentence I had spoken had shut every door behind them. I didn't smile, nor did I gloat. I simply let them see that the truth needed no embellishment, only exposure. And they, through their own arrogance, had authored their own indictment. I turned and walked slowly away from the circle of people, leaving behind only the echo of the sisters' desperate scream. The crowd began to disperse, but the murmurs didn't stop. A young man chuckled quietly. "That Lamborghini stuck in the mud like that, you just know it's gonna go viral again." A woman sighed. "It's karma, really. They disrespected the land, disrespected others, and now they've brought this on themselves." I heard every word, and I knew what happened today would spread even further. By the time I reached my porch, my phone had been buzzing nonstop. Dozens of messages, hundreds of new comments. The clip of the Lamborghini sinking into the mud was being shared everywhere, tagged with the caption, "If you trespass, you pay." I read each comment, and saw a range of reactions. Some laughed, some mocked, some expressed outrage, but they all had one thing in common. No one believed Wellington was untouchable anymore. I sat on the fence and let out a long breath. There was no more bitterness in me, only relief. The land had spoken for me. The community had seen the truth, and the law had confirmed it. Wellington could keep shouting, but every word now echoed into emptiness. If you saw a Lamborghini sink like that, would you laugh or feel pity? The day the authorities issued their decision, the whole neighborhood packed into the town hall. It was no longer rumors or vague arguments, but an official verdict from the regulatory body. The tension was like a drawn string. Everyone was waiting to see whether Wellington could slide away as they always had before. The official read the finding, his voice firm. "After inspecting, verifying documentation, and comparing with conditions on the ground, we conclude that Mrs. Claudia and Mrs. Beatrice Wellington repeatedly violated private property, endangering the landowner's assets and livestock. This behavior is a serious violation," the hall gasped. No one could hide their surprise. Sideward glances, suppressed smiles, all eyes turned toward me. Claudia jumped to her feet, slammed her hand on the table, shouting, "Impossible! Are you mocking the name Wellington?" Beatrice jumped in, her voice quivering but vicious. "This is an insult. We will not accept this." But the official would not be interrupted, continuing. "In addition to administrative penalties, all rescue costs, repairs to the vehicle, as well as damages caused to the farm, shall be borne by you both. I felt my chest tighten when I heard that, not because of the money I didn't care how much, but because for the first time, the power of Wellington was publicly exposed. For years, they hid behind the HOA's shadow, imposed their will, and escaped consequence. But today, in front of the community, in front of the law, they were forced to face consequences. Whispers spread across the room. A neighbor in the back row spoke up loud enough. That's right. Let's see if they still think other people's land is their playground. A woman laughed. Luxury car now turned into scrap and mud, and still paying a fortune. Looks like heaven has eyes. Those words made Claudia's face flush, and Beatrice crouched down, jaw clenched. I stood and spoke, calm but loud enough to echo. Justice is never cheap. It has its cost, and today you must pay it. No shouting, no extra gesture, just a short sentence that drew applause sweeping through the room, drowning out the weak curses of the two sisters. Claudia tried to salvage what dignity remained, shouting, "We will appeal, we will take this to court," but her voice sounded weak among harsh laughter. No one believed in Wellington's invincibility anymore. They were no longer a symbol of power, but living proof that arrogance can be overturned by the law. I looked at them, no hate, no mercy. In my eyes, there was only clarity, from someone who has lived through all humiliation, standing now before a victory that needed no embellishment. I know the battle is not over. They will try to fight back, but the ground has From now on, I am no longer the hunted today. They become the ones watched, forced by justice to bow. When the meeting ended, people drifted away, and many handshakes and congratulations were offered to me. Someone quietly said, "You did what we never dared." I nodded, no flowery words needed, because I understood that what was paid today is only the beginning. Behind it lies the weight on Wellington's honor. Their name will cling to consequences heavier than any fine. I stepped out of the hall, took a long breath, sensation of air lighter than ever. The sky was high and blue, the breeze cool, as though the land itself exhaled relief. I knew the battle had truly turned a page, and from here on, every step of Claudia and Beatrice would only lead them deeper into the pit they themselves had dug. As the applause in the hall died down, I stood and left behind one sentence: justice is never cheap. A short phrase, heavy enough to silence the room. Claudia and Beatrice were frozen, their eyes full of hatred, as if wanting to burn me where I stood, but in that rage, I saw fear. They'd understood that this time, Wellington was no longer perched on unassailable power. I turned my back and walked down the bright corridor. Cool air hit my face, but inside me burned. I knew the official ruling was only the start. The real repercussions would come as Wellington's reputation was trampled in public, and I knew that would happen sooner than the expected time. Just days later, the press joined in. A local paper published under the headline, "Wellington Sisters, From HOA Icons to Community Shame." The article didn't only tell of the stuck Lamborghini, but also dug into the past. They found witnesses from other neighborhoods who had been oppressed Claudia and Beatrice, forced to sell homes cheaply. Those people came forward, one by one, to recount the humiliation they endured. A middle-aged woman appeared in the feature, her voice trembling. They threatened me, said if I didn't move, they'd accuse me of violating rules. I had to leave the house that my parents left. A man, eyes red, added, "I spoke up once. They labeled me a troublemaker. In the end, my whole family had to leave." Those stories flooded newspapers and social media. The internet community no longer just mocked the car stuck in mud, they were truly outraged. Comments poured, "This isn't the first time. How many suffered in silence out of fear? They must be brought court." I read every line, an unfamiliar feeling swelling in me. It turned out I wasn't the only one humiliated. That truth sorrowed me, yet made me stronger, because I understood justice was moving beyond my land. It was becoming a shared fight for all who had been trampled by Wellington. Of course, Claudia and Beatrice did not sit idle. They hired lawyers, released press statements, and insisted that all was defamation. But the more they tried to justify, the more clearly their panic showed. Their faces on TV looked restless, their voices unsteady, so far from the arrogant confidence they once held. A major television network replayed the footage of them screaming in the mud, then cut it together with testimonies from past victims. The contrast was striking. From a picture of power to figures of disgrace, the anchor concluded, "There are those who believe that money and an HOA title can shield them forever, but a small pit of mud was all it took to reveal the truth." I sat and watched, calm. I had nothing more to say, because the truth now spoke for itself. I only remembered the hateful glares Claudia and Beatrice gave me at the hearing, and I knew those looks wouldn't save them anymore. The public had seen clearly, and once outrage is awakened, no power can suppress it. In the days that followed, the neighborhood grew unusually quiet. No one dared mention the Wellington name with reverence anymore. Wherever they went, whispers followed, fingers pointed. Those who once bowed now avoided them altogether, some not even offering a greeting. The isolation crept in, tightening its grip step by step. I sat on the porch, gazing out at the wide open field, quiet sense of relief settling in. I knew justice never comes easily, and just as I'd said before, it's never cheap. Finally, the truth had begun to surface, and this time, it wasn't just standing with me, it was standing against all those who had ever been forced into silence under Wellington's reign. The media didn't stop at the sunken Lamborghini. They dug deeper. Local papers, then national outlets, began reporting, uncovering a long history of harassment, coercion, and manipulation carried out by Claudia and Beatrice in every neighborhood they once managed. Stories once buried began to resurface, each piece revealing another layer of their dark past. A middle-aged man spoke during an interview. "I once stood up to them when they forced me to repaint my fence just because they didn't like the color. I was heavily fined, repeatedly summoned to meetings, and publicly shamed in front of the community. In the end, I had no choice to sell my house and leave." His voice trembled, his eyes clouded with bitterness. Another woman, her hair more silver than black, held up a photo of her old home. "Claudia once told me directly that if I didn't comply with the rules they made up, they would fabricate plaints to paint me as a troublemaker. I didn't have the strength to fight, so I gave in and left." Even now, thinking back, it still feels humiliating. These accusations sent public outrage into overdrive. As more victims came forward, the picture became unmistakably clear. Claudia and Beatrice were no longer seen as polished women in pastel suits, but as ruthless tyrants hiding behind an HOA title. Each story made its way online, often paired with the image of the Lamborghini buried in mud, turning it into a symbol of their downfall. Online comments stopped being joke. People started calling it a community-wide crime spree. Outrage mounted as the public realized just how long this arrogance had gone unchecked. Accusation videos flooded social media, drawing millions of views under hashtags like "they must pay," "no one is above justice," and "this isn't the first time, and they're not the only victims." Claudia and Beatrice hired lawyers, trying to dismiss the allegations, but their voices shook during a brief press conference. Claudia stammered, "It's all lies, all jealousy." Beatrice tried to interrupt, but the more she spoke, the more the audience turned against. Their words carried no weight, drowned out by a wave of evidence and the bitter memories of countless residents. I sat on my porch and watched it all unfold in silence. I realized this was no longer just about me or my land. It had grown into a movement to expose the truth. Justice was no longer just a word. It had become a fire lit by those who once stayed silent. I felt lighter, knowing I was no longer the only voice in this fight. Deep down, I knew Claudia and Beatrice had cornered themselves. Former victims were no longer afraid. The public was no longer fooled, and their wealth could no longer protect. The Wellington name, once a symbol of power, had become a stain of disgrace, and this was only the beginning of a fall they never imagined. From once being hailed as the wealthy ladies of the neighborhood, Claudia and Beatrice were now whispered about as those notorious Karen. Every time they stepped outside, whispers and sidelong glances followed. Old friends, those who once clung to the Wellington name for borrowed status, began to disappear. No more invitations to wine tastings, no more Instagram photos tagged with their name. One afternoon, I saw Claudia walking through the small market. A few vendors turned away in silence, while others let out faint, mocking chuckles as she passed. The woman who was once greeted wherever she went now carried her own basket, picking items one by one, with no one acknowledging her. I watched the scene and saw, clearly, the slow descent of someone who had lived too long in the shadow of power. Beatrice fared worse. Every time she went out, neighborhood children would tease her, pointing and laughing. "There goes Mrs. Karen Lamborghini." Every giggle was like a blade slicing into her pride. I saw her shoulders trembling, her eyes red, yet she still forced herself to hold her head high. But that raised chin no longer radiated pride. It was sheer stubbornness, frail and desperate. Even in HOA meetings, where they once reigned supreme, only hushed whispers remained. Whenever Claudia spoke, the room fell dead, silent not out of respect, but because no one cared to listen. When Beatrice tried to chime in, another member cut her off bluntly. "Let someone else speak. It'll save time." Her face went pale, but she said nothing back. The power they once gripped so tightly was crumbling, piece by piece, and no one wanted it anymore. I watched it all and felt a quiet sigh escape me. I knew this was only the beginning, just as I had said. Because this isolation wasn't temporary, it was the consequence of years spent in arrogance, dismissing others. Once the facade was torn down, the contempt wouldn't vanish overnight. It clung to them, heavy like a shadow that could never be shaken off. A few neighbors had once confided in me, "We stayed silent for too long. That's why we'll never let them reclaim their old place." Hearing that, I felt my own resolve harden. The truth didn't just bring justice to me, it awakened a community, made them realize it was time to rise. Claudia and Beatrice now lived under a heavy silence. Every step outside was a social sentence. They struggled, tried to cling to the last scraps of dignity, but only sank deeper into disgrace. I knew this was the price of arrogance, not material loss, but complete isolation. When an entire community turns away, I looked out over my endless green fields and drew a long breath. Justice had begun to move, and this time could not be stopped. I whispered, as if reminding myself, "This is only the beginning." As the articles continued to expose one story after another, those who once flocked around Claudia and Beatrice suddenly vanished. The party invitations stopped, the phone stayed silent, and no one tagged them in glamorous photos on social media anymore. Friends turned their back, neighbors pretended not to see them when passing by. I sat on my front porch, witnessing the change unfold day by day, without saying a word, quietly observing how their once mighty power crumbled. One morning, Claudia stepped out of her gate, trying to maintain the poise of a lady, but her face was heavy with strain. She walked past a group of neighbors chatting, but instead of greetings or small talk like before, they turned their heads away, continuing their conversation mid-sentence, treating her as if she were invisible. Claudia's steps faltered, then quickened, as if trying to escape the thick wall of silence closing in around her. Beatrice had it worse. Every time she appeared, the neighborhood kids gather and giggle. "There's Karen Lamborghini." The laughter was innocent, but to her, it was unbearable ridicule. Beatrice snatched her handbag close and turned to flee, but the laughter echoed behind her. The pride she once wore like armor was now shredded by those childish, mocking voices. Even in HOA meeting, once their stage of absolute control, they now tasted exclusion. When Claudia stood to speak, the room fell silent, not out of respect, but because no one wanted to hear. A member at the head of the table said coldly, "Let others speak, for fairness." Beatrice bit her lip. Claudia swallowed hard, her gaze darkening. There were no applause lines, no eager followers. They were cast out, right in the very space they once ruled. I saw clearly that this isolation was harsher than any penalty. It didn't come from the authorities, or from me, it came from the very community they once treated as their own. No more greetings, no more handshake, they had become shadows in the neighborhood. The pastel-colored suits couldn't hide the fatigue in their eyes, nor could their polished hair conceal the tremble in each step. A neighbor stopped by, gave me a dry smile, and said, "Now they know what it feels like to be dismissed." I nodded, saying nothing, because I knew the worst thing for Claudia and Beatrice wasn't losing money, it was losing the respect of those around them. Their power had been built on the community's fear, and once that fear dissolved, they had nothing left but emptiness. I watched their backs in the quiet afternoon, walking quickly, trying to hold on to some semblance of pride while clearly wilting inside. The name Wellington, once whispered with admiration, had become a sneer. Every time someone muttered, "Karen Lamborghini," crowd would burst out laughing. I sat still, exhaling slowly. Justice hadn't only emerged from the mud, but from every cold stare, every collective rejection, they could no longer resist. I sat on the front porch, eyes fixed on the dirt road still bearing the marks of the Lamborghini's tires. The wind rustled through the trees like a slow song, reminding me of every moment that had passed. I heard the whispers in the neighborhood, the sound of children playing, calling the sisters Karen Lamborghini. I smiled to myself, because I knew the lesson was sinking into every step they took. Claudia and Beatrice no longer walked like rulers. Every time they appeared, their shoulders were tense, their eyes more often on the ground than facing forward. I realized the isolation had taken root, and what they lost wasn't just reputation, but also the false authority that once made the neighborhood bow. Yet the remnants of old pride still clung to them, keeping them from admitting defeat. They struggled, trying to prove they still had a voice, but the more they tried, the more misplaced they became. Then one day, word spread that Claudia would hold a brief meeting at the community hall. People didn't come out of curiosity, but to hear what lies she might tell this time. I was there too, standing at the back of the room, silently observing. The air was thick, taut like a stage set for a play, with an ending everyone already knew. Claudia stepped up to the podium, no longer carrying her usual confidence. She wore the familiar light-colored suit, but instead of radiating power, it looked out of place, wrinkled under the light. Beatrice stood beside her, head bowed, eyes red. When Claudia began to speak, her voice trembled, each word dragged from her throat. "We were wrong." The room fell silent. Chairs creaked softly, as some leaned forward to hear. Claudia took a deep breath and continued. "We let arrogance cloud our judgment. We disrespected our neighbors. We harmed the community. We apologize." Her voice broke on the last word, no longer resonant, only exhausted. Beatrice lifted her head, eyes wet, and whispered, "We truly were wrong. I'm sorry." Her voice was so soft that many had to strain to hear, but those who did understood it was an unwilling admission, a collapse they never imagined making. I stood still. What I felt wasn't the triumphant satisfaction I once envisioned, but a quiet sense of resolution. I had said from the beginning that justice would reveal itself. And now, justice wasn't just the mud that swallowed a luxury car, but two people who once saw themselves as untouchable, bowing their heads in admission. A voice rang out from the middle rows. "An apology won't fix a bogged-down tire or restore trust that's already broken." Murmurs of agreement followed. Claudia gripped the microphone, lips trembling, but had no reply. Beatrice broke down crying, covering her face with her hands still stained by unwashed mud. I stepped forward, said nothing, and only looked directly at them. Claudia met my gaze, then quickly looked away, as if dodging an invisible verdict. In that look, I saw no arrogance, only a hollow ruin. When the meeting ended, no one applauded. The crowd quietly filed out, leaving Claudia and Beatrice stranded on the stage. They had hoped for forgiveness, but all they received was a cold, indifferent silence. Because the entire community understood, no late apology could erase the years of contempt and injustice they had inflicted. I stepped outside, the wind sweeping hard across the fields. I told myself, this downfall wasn't meant for me to revel in their pain, but to serve as a reminder that arrogance always has a price. I didn't need forgiveness, nor did I need revenge, because I knew the truth had already taught them a lesson harsher than any scolding ever could. From that point on, I no longer saw Claudia and Beatrice as enemies, but as mirrors, reflecting the consequences of pride. They would go on living, but they would forever be haunted by this day, the day they had to say the words, "We were wrong." And for me, that was enough. Would you forgive someone after a belated apology, or let them pay their own price? I had thought Claudia and Beatrice would cling to their pride much longer. With everything I had witnessed before, the way they stood at the podium, without a flicker of doubt, the meetings they commanded as if every objection were just background noise in a dream woven from power, I believed it would take months, even years, to bring them to their knees. But I underestimated the pressure of public opinion. Nothing moves faster than a community once suppressed, and now given the chance to push back. The whispers from neighbors, from local residents, from even those who had once stayed silent, all surged like a raging tide, washing away the mask the Wellington sisters had worn for so many years. Wellington used to be a name people avoided, like an unspoken authority, quiet power that made others step aside. Now, that name had become nothing more than a punchline over afternoon tea, a tale to mock, no longer one to fear. In the end, one of them, whether from exhaustion or lack of escape, was forced to lower herself in public. That bow didn't come from remorse, I knew that. It came from pressure, from the stares that no longer turned away, from the questions hurled relentlessly by journalists, officials, and even everyday residents like a downpour in a thunderstorm. They knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. And so that afternoon, the community hall filled up once more, like a stage awaiting the final act of a long brewing tragedy. No invitations were sent, no announcements made. People gathered as if silently summoned by a shared instinct, the instinct of those who had endured enough and now waited for a reckoning. The atmosphere inside the hall was thick. The old room seemed suddenly alive, every wooden panel soaked in anticipation. Every chair, a front row seat, every person present not just as a witness, but as a silent judge. No one spoke loudly, but the murmurs under the surface pulsed like an undertow, battering Claudia and Beatrice's nerves. I sat near the front, hands resting on my knees, eyes fixed ahead. I wasn't there for the theater. I came to witness a new chapter, one where truth no longer had to hide. Claudia stepped onto the wooden podium, her walk stiff and unnatural, as if each step sliced into the last remnants of her pride. The light-colored suit she wore, likely chosen to project grace, only made her seem more misplaced in a room screaming for sincerity. Her eyes scanned the room, mechanically, instinctively, searching for something that no longer exists. Allied, but no one met her gaze. Every face turned away, or looked at her with a coldness that cut deeper than anger. Beatrice stood behind her, face ashen, chapped, eyes sunken as if she hadn't slept in days. Perhaps she knew this moment was the breaking point she could no longer avoid. When Claudia finally spoke, her voice trembled, stripped of the sharpness once used to command every decision in this neighborhood. "We were wrong." Whispers rose from the rows of seats like gentle waves, soft, full of force. No one laughed, and no one clapped. It was that very silence that became a mirror, magnifying the shame. Claudia swallowed, throat raw like it had been scraped thorns, trying to steady herself, then repeated, this time her voice hoarse, "We were wrong to disregard the rules, to disrespect our neighbors, and to harm this community. I apologize." She bowed her head, a slow, heavy bow not out of courtesy, but because she knew that without it, she would be cast off this stage forever. Beatrice stepped forward. She stared at the floor, her hands clenched tightly as if trying to keep them from shaking. Her lips moved. "We were wrong. I apologize." Her voice was so soft that those sitting far back had to lean in to hear, but it was clear enough to leave a mark on everyone's ears. Final acceptance of defeat. The two women who once commanded storms now stood there bare-handed and stripped of all pretense, with nothing left to shield them. I didn't take my eyes off them. I wanted them to see me, not to humiliate them, but so they would fully grasp who it was they once mocked, who they had tried to bury. I wanted my gaze to bear witness to the moment they fell from their self-made throne. I rose slowly, stepping into the center of the room. No one stopped. I didn't need permission. My voice was cold and slow, like water dripping steadily on stone. An apology doesn't fix a sunken car. The whole room let out a gasp. A few people laughed, some clapped. Then the applause spread like a storm, chaotic, but heavy with weight. In the crowd, someone called out, voice sharp satisfaction. "She deserves every bit of it." More voices followed, sharper than any official charge. Claudia and Beatrice stood on the podium, heads down, shoulders trembling. No one threw stones, but each look, each chuckle, deeper than any blade into the image they had so carefully crafted. I had no more to say. I let the community speak for itself. They were no longer afraid, no longer silent. And in every pair of eyes, I saw that mix of vindication and release, the freedom from the long shadow cast by the Wellington. Every word, every clap, was a reckoning with the past. No restitution needed, no courts required, just the truth laid bare for all to see. When the meeting ended, no one stayed to console or support Claudia and Beatrice. They stood alone, adrift in a room growing empty. The echo of footsteps leaving rang like a final verdict. Nothing dramatic, yet nothing more painful than the silence of others after a fall. I watched the scene, and something stirred within, not quite triumph, but a deep, quiet satisfaction feeling when an old wound finally seals and stops bleeding. That night, social media exploded. The clip of Claudia admitting her faults was shared everywhere, followed by an avalanche of comments. Some were mocking, too little, too late, and hardly sincere. Some were bitter, so arrogant when in power, now crying when it's gone. But a few were softer. At least they finally bowed their head, even if late. I read them all without judgment, without response. I let the truth speak for itself, because I knew words no longer belonged to me, but to the community, the people who had once been silent, now raising their voices louder than any legal verdict. Neighbors stopped by my house. Many shook my hand and offered congratulations. One said, "You gave us the courage to speak up." Another nodded quietly. "Thanks to you, this community finally escaped the shadow." I listened and smiled. I hadn't done anything grand. I had only stood up when too far. But sometime, all it takes is one person willing to stand, and the darkness has to retreat. That's not philosophy, it's lived experience, paid for with years of solitude and pain. After the confession, Claudia and Beatrice all but disappeared from community life. They no longer dared show up to meeting, no longer walked through the market with their heads held high. Their shadow remained, but not from authority, only from the echo of failure. The way they looked at me was full of hatred, but beneath it, I saw helplessness. I understood their apology didn't come from remorse, from pressure, from being cornered by public scrutiny. And yet, it was still a fall they couldn't avoid, one they would remember for a long time. I sat on the porch, night wind brushing past, listening to the soft hum of insects. Moonlight fell on the lawn out front, the same patch of grass where I had once worked every evening without notice. I thought about the question repeated in so many comments: should a late apology be forgiven? I didn't answer definitively. Forgiveness isn't something I need, nor is it what the community needs. What mattered was that the truth had been acknowledged, and arrogance had been brought down. To me, everything was clear. Justice doesn't mean turning enemies into friends, nor does it mean offering reluctant forgiveness. Sometimes, justice is simply making the arrogant stand before the community and, with trembling voices, saying the words, "We were wrong." And in that, fairness is restored, not on paper, not by signatures, through the awakening of a once suppressed community. That's the ending, not perfect, but enough for me to hold my head high and move forward. The news of Claudia and Beatrice's public confession spread through the neighborhood like a spark catching dry straw. It didn't stop at whispers between housewives at the market. It echoed in the corner cafe, wove into every casual conversation. From elders who had lived here their entire lives to the young adults just stepping into the world, everyone knew the story. And what I hadn't expected was that people weren't just talking about the downfall of the Wellingtons, they had begun to mention my name with a newfound respect. Gone were the averted gazes and uneasy shrugs whenever I appeared. I could feel the shift in every glance, every quiet but firm nod, every greeting once withheld out of fear of association, or simply because indifference had become routine. This community had been silent too long, endured too much, like a still lake hiding years of pent-up waves beneath its surface. And now, they needed a landmark, something to stand on, to believe that justice wasn't just a faraway ideal printed in books. A few days later, the village council convened an official meeting. Unlike the usual half-empty and disinterested gatherings, this one pulsed with anticipation, tight as a drawn string. An hour before it even started, the room was full, every wooden chair taken, people lining the walls or sitting cross-legged on the floor. No one complained, no one left. I walked in among them, no longer feeling the weight I used to carry during past meetings. The wary eyes, the hushed side comments, they were gone. In their place was a quiet calm, as if I had entered a space where, at last, I was acknowledged, heard. They didn't see me as a troublemaker anymore, but as a living witness to the truth, to perseverance, to a belief that refused to bend. Outside, the autumn sun cast gold across the road leading to the hall. The almond trees had begun to turn, and the wind rustled through their leaves like the whispered voice of time. I looked up, watching sunlight stream through the window slat, falling onto the wooden floor in long beams that lit both past and present. When the meeting began, the head of the council stood and spoke, his voice steady, unflinching, free from the evasiveness that clings to those too used to compromise. "We've reviewed all the facts," he said. "We've checked the land records and listened to voices from all sides. The conclusion is this: he, the farmer who was pushed around by the Wellingtons, was right from the very beginning." The room erupted in in murmurs that couldn't be contained, then quickly rose into a wave of applause. The same hands that had stayed silent now clapped with a resounding force, echoing through the hall as if to make up for all the months they hadn't dared to speak, as if every clap was an apology, form of redemption for every time they had looked the other way. I sat there, quietly observing, saying nothing. A strange feeling rose within me, a mix of relief and bitterness. I didn't need applause, didn't seek gratitude, but that applause, firm and sustained, was proof that the truth was no longer buried. It had been acknowledged, made public, and could no longer be denied. It was the echo of a community waking up from a long, uneasy sleep. The head of the council continued, this time with a slight catch in his voice, though still resolute. From now on, the rights of farmers in this area will be strictly protected. We will establish clear regulations to prevent any acts of encroachment. No one, not even those with titles or status, will be allowed to cross that line. His words rang out like a new declaration, strong, unwavering. I saw a few elders in the village discreetly wipe their eyes, their expressions a mixture of emotion and disbelief. Perhaps deep down, they never thought this day would come, the day justice would be etched back into everyday life, not with lofty words but with concrete acts, with rules that protect them. Another council member stood up, someone I had clashed with in many hopeless debates, and this time, he looked me in the eye. His voice was slow and measured. We must admit we once dismissed your warning, even laughed when you stood up to defend your land. Today, on behalf of the council, I apologize for that silence. I didn't reply right away, only nodded, because I knew this apology came from sincerity. Unlike the forced confessions from the Wellington, my silence in that moment wasn't rejection, it was acknowledgement, quiet recognition that they finally understood. Then, one by one, members of the community stood to speak. A burly man, his voice like thunder, said loudly, "We were too afraid of false power, and we let them trample us." But he didn't back down, and because of that, we now have the chance to speak our truth. A woman next to him continued, her voice trembling but resolute. From now on, we must stand together, protect one another, and never let anyone be made a laughingstock like he once was. Each statement struck like a hammer blow against the numbshell that had wrapped this community for too long. I sat and listened, feeling a lightness in my chest. What I had endured was no longer meaningless. It had become the catalyst for the community to find its voice again, to believe they had the right to speak, the right to exist with dignity intact. At the end of the meeting, the council leader concluded, "We will rebuild trust together. The rights of farmers, every piece of land, will be our top priority. There will be no room left for arrogance." Applause erupted again, this time louder and longer than before. I lifted my head, feeling it clearly. I was no longer alone. The months I spent wading through fields alone, knocking on the doors of agencies, journalists, and neighbors in search of fairness, those efforts had been answered. Not with titles, not with money, but with solidarity, with the firm handshake of a community newly reborn. Stepping out of the hall, the late afternoon sunlight spilled onto the pavement, tinting each tile in gold. Several people came up to shake my hand. An elderly man with silver hair, who had avoided me for an entire year, whispered, "You stood up on our behalf. In my whole life, I've never seen the Wellingtons bow their heads until today." A younger man clapped my shoulder. "You made us believe that justice isn't some far-off dream." I responded with a smile. Not grand, not proud, but sincere. Because I understood that sometimes, it's the long silence that makes a genuine word all the more valuable. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the cattle graze slowly under the crescent moon. The wind swept across the field, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the soft chorus of crickets. I thought about the days when I was mocked, humiliated, to the brink of despair. There were moments when I truly believed the truth would stay buried in the mud forever, that I was just a lone cry drowned in a crowd of turned back. But then I remembered the moment the council publicly declared I had been right all along. It was like the mud had finally been washed away, revealing a field lit clear and clean. Field where every speck of soil, every blade of grass, remembers that someone once refused to bow. Sometimes, justice arrives late, but when it does, carries enough weight to shift an entire community. I knew then that arrogance would no longer have a place to thrive, and I, along with those like me, could now walk this land with our heads held high. After days of chaos filled with shouting, tense meetings, triumphant laughter, and trembling confessions, life slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, like a gentle stream after a storm. Major upheavals always leave echoes, but the strange thing is, people somehow learned to embrace calm again, as if the turbulence had never touched them. Early in the morning, I opened the old wooden door, the one once slammed in anger, and stepped out onto the porch. A deep breath filled my lungs. Before me, a green pasture stretched out, and the cattle moved slowly like a peaceful army. Sunlight fell on them, casting clear shadows against the crisp blue sky, tranquil scene once only imagined in the hardest days. The murmur of the herd, the soft thuds of hooves on grass, the low, whisper-like moos together formed a gentle symphony, needing no lyrics yet enough to soothe the soul. I stood still, breathing in the scent of wet soil after last night's rain, remembering that I was born and raised in this land, a simple truth, once denied by those who thought themselves above fields and farms. The grown cattle now walked calmly, no longer wild-eyed, no longer bellowing in fear every time Claudia and Beatrice drove too close to the pens just to assert control. Back then, their actions made my blood boil, but now they feel like nothing more than a fading wisp of smoke. The cows now graze quietly, occasionally flicking their tails to shoo flies, some even lying flat in the field, as if nothing in the world could bother them. I leaned against the wooden fence, my hand trailing over rusted nails, my breath sinking with the calm. Someone once told me peace was a luxury. I used to believe that, but now I understand. Peace is never far away. It's right here in the calm eyes of animals, in the birdsong resting on the morning fence, in the quiet left behind once the noisemakers are gone. When the source of chaos disappears, serenity returns on its own, like water settling after the final stone sink. The calf that once broke its leg has now fully recovered. Watching it leap through the pasture, tail swinging, eyes gleaming under the sun, my heart felt warm. At times, playfully nudged its mother's leg, then jumped back, bellowing like it had just claimed victory. I followed its every bounce as if I saw myself in it, from being cornered, to stumbling, to standing again despite aching legs and a bleeding spirit. The calf is no longer crippled, and neither am I. The wounds to my dignity, my pride, my faith in justice, they've all healed. Not just with time, but because the truth was finally called by its rightful name. We both made it through, not needing pity, not needing rescue. In the afternoon, I took my fishing rod to the small pond at the edge of the farm. That pond used to be the place I came to breathe on days when I couldn't speak up. Now, its surface was calm, rippling gently under the golden light of late day, as if it had never reflected the times I sat crying there alone. The cicadas buzzed from the trees around the pond, blending with the wind sweeping across the fields, forming a symphony of peace, not an empty peace, but one with root, with depth. I sat down on the old wooden chair, the one long decayed but never replaced, a testament to patience. I cast the bait into the water, watched the surface ripple in tiny rings, then leaned back and let my body relax. As each minute passed, my mind lightened, as if slowly cleansed of all those days filled with shouting. My daughter sat beside me, her eyes bright. She no longer carried the worried look she had when the HOA surrounded us, no longer asked, "Are you okay, Dad?" with a voice trembling in fear. Now, her face was like another pond, still, crystal clear. She smiled as she looked at the water, a smile that made every wound I ever bore feel worthwhile. I gently held her small hand, the same hand that once shook in terror seeing her father insulted in the street, now resting calmly like the evening itself. We sat like that for a long time. The breeze drifted, the sky shifted color, few dried almond leaves fell onto the pond, and spun in slow circles. Every now and then, fish splashed, sending water up onto the bank, making her laugh out loud. That laughter echoed far, louder than the crowd's accusation, as if wiping away all the darkness that once smothered this home. I looked at her and thought, maybe justice isn't just about punishing the arrogant, but about bringing peace to those we love. Justice isn't found in court ruling, but in the simple return of an ordinary afternoon, the ability to laugh with your child without feeling a weight on your chest. Days passed, and peace became a habit. I no longer heard the roar of aggressive engines tearing up the dirt road each morning. I no longer saw the disdainful glances from those behind luxury car windows, no longer felt watched with every step. The neighborhood grew quieter, not out of sadness, but because people had learned how to live together. They started greeting one another more often, as if everyone had realized a simple "good morning" could be the beginning of an entire decent community. At night, I often sat on the porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. My wooden house was still old, still without a yard light, but the sky didn't need artificial light to shine. I remembered the moments when I nearly broke, those days I was mocked, called a troublemaker, seen as a stain in other people's eyes. I remembered the laughter, the dismissive look, even the time someone brushed off my warnings as if I were just a lunatic. Then I remembered the day that Lamborghini's wheels sank into the mud. That image replayed in my mind like a symbol of justice. And I remember the moment the entire hall broke into applause when I proved the truth. Felt like a dream finally closing. A dream that had been real but no longer painful. Now, only a new chapter remains, a chapter of one morning, while tending to the plants by the fence, I saw Claudia and Beatrice quietly leaving the neighborhood. No convoy of luxury cars followed, no scoffing laughter drifting out from behind tinted windows, just two worn figures, dragging a few old suitcases. No one came to see them off, no one turned to look. They left like people who once believed they were untouchable, now forced to slip away in silence. I watched from afar, neither angry nor pitying. Inside me, only one one thought echoed, softly but firmly, you reap what you sow. Justice doesn't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, it arrives in absolute silence, where dignity melts away, and no one bothers to pick it up. When their silhouettes faded, I turned back to the fields. The cattle still grazed calmly, as if no turmoil had ever occurred. The young calf still leapt about, occasionally letting out a playful cry, as if thanking life for a second chance. The pond still reflected the blue sky, its surface as still as my heart felt now. I sat down, cast my line, and my daughter settled beside me again. Her smile remained, a smile that needed no words, enough to tell me that the storm had truly passed. I whispered, like a closing line meant for myself, not for anyone else to hear, clear within my own mind. A chapter closes in peace, and I knew from this day on there would only be birdsong, the lowing of cattle, the wind rushing through the fields and quiet afternoons by the pond, where justice has no name, but lives in every breath. I've lived through enough days of being pushed down, dismissed, and mocked, so that now when it's all behind me, when the echoes of scornful laughter linger only in memory, and when the entire community has taken the side of truth, I can sit down, quietly, and close the story with a few simple words. Not grand declarations, not a final flourish to satisfy an ego that has long worn thin from years of silent endurance. Just truths drawn from the very land I live on, from the labor my hands have weathered, and from wounds that never bled but deep into pride. These words to me are not proclamation, but the distilled essence of experience, of a belief cleansed by the storm. I look out toward the field, where the cattle still graze peacefully, where the calf that once broke its leg now runs and leaps without tiring. The afternoon sun slants gently through drifting clouds, bathing their bodies in golden light like dabs of serenity on a wide canvas. High above, the white clouds drift slowly, as if lazily watching every shift below. It's so peaceful, you'd never believe this place had once been the stage for such a fierce battle. Not of bullets, not of broken bones, but of dignity, pride, and of patience stretched to its limits. I breathe in deeply, slowly, letting the clean air sink into my chest, then speak the words aloud, not loudly, but just enough for the wind to catch and carry them beyond the borders of this village. Never believe that money gives you the right to trample others. I don't need applause or nods of agreement. These words aren't meant to impress, but are more like smoke released after a fire that's burned quietly for too long. The wind sweeps across the field, soft and steady, as if nodding in agreement, as if promising to carry that sentence to rooftops and doorways, to those who once bowed before fake opulence. Because I know what happened here is not just a lesson for Claudia and Beatrice. For anyone who believes wealth can mask arrogance. Money can buy lawyers, buy luxury cars, buy silence for a moment, but it can't buy respect. And it can't buy back trust once the community has seen your and most importantly, money can't stop a downfall when the line has been crossed. I pause for a moment, looking down at my calloused hands, hands that once shoveled manure, built fences, pushed carts of hay through the mud on soaking afternoons. The small cracks, the sun-darkened skin, the knotted knuckles, all of it proof of a life with no short. These are the same hands that once dug the muddy trap not out of hatred, but because there was no other way. But deeper still, they are the hands that held on to this land, every square foot of it, with sweat, patience, and with a quiet love that never needed to be spoken. I go on, my voice lowering but firm, as if carving the words into the wind. Land, like people, has a limit to how much it can take. That sentence rang true like a fact that needed no proof. I remembered the days Claudia and Beatrice drove through the field, tires spraying dirt on me while I herded the cattle. I remembered their scoffing laughs, the curses shouted from behind rolled-down windows, calling me a filthy farmer, worthless. I remembered my daughter's eyes brimming with tears, terrified as she watched her father humiliated while no one spoke up. I remembered the calf that broke its leg when they revved their engine near the pen, panicked herd crashing through the gate, and even the neighbors whisper, "Stay out of it. It's not worth it." None of it was just about land. It was about dignity, about the self-respect of a man who tried to live decently. And dignity, like land, once trampled too far, pushes back in ways no one expects, silent, fierce. I looked up, eyes tracing the cracks in the soil where the mud trap once was, now slowly sealed over. Young grass had grown back, mingling with the deep tire mark, as if nature itself trying to erase the evidence. I added one more sentence, each word sharpened by everything I'd lived through. When you cross that line, the price you pay will be harsher than any punishment. Claudia and Beatrice once believed the law would be on their side, that a silent community would forever stay afraid, that they could keep pressing the gas and laughing through flying mud. They believed wealth was immunity, that it was armor against all judgment. But one day, that gleaming white Lamborghini sank into the very mud they'd disdained. Even the tow truck couldn't pull it out. The wheel sank deep, the engine roared uselessly. Their elegant clothes were soiled, their screams pierced across fields that usually only echoed with cattle's calls. That was when the collapse began of their reputation, their power, their friendships, and their honor. They were forced to stand before the community and admit their wrongs, not because they were caught, but because there was nowhere left to run. It wasn't a court's verdict. It was the sentence passed by gazes, by collective memory. And that sentence, it stung deeper than any legal legal ruling. I remembered the moment Claudia stepped out of the car, mud caked from her pants to the hem of her skirt, her expensive shoes submerged in black water. Her eyes scanned for help, found only silence. Beatrice clung to the car door, her lips pressed so tightly they turned pale. That image stood for a truth no one could deny. The arrogant are often brought down by the very land they considered beneath. There was no need for prison, no need for a judgment with legal clauses. Public disgrace alone was enough to crush every mask they'd ever worn. I sat down on the wooden steps where I used to listen quietly to rumors about myself, where I once considered selling everything and leaving this place behind. Now, it was the same spot where I could finally rest my eyes in the breeze of a peaceful afternoon. My daughter came near, holding her old teddy bear, her smile glowing like a sunset over still water. I placed my hand on her shoulder, light, firm, as if to pass on something: fatherly love, part unspoken inheritance. I spoke the final line, not just for her but for the whole world beyond us, a sentence that needed no explanation, yet carried everything I had lived through. Sometimes justice only needs a patch of mud. Not every patch of mud can swallow a car, but sometimes, all it takes is one misstep, one unexpected moment, and justice reveals itself in the simplest way, not flashy, not convoluted, but direct and undeniable. Just like this story, justice didn't come from angry shouting, but from the moment a whole community witnessed the truth laid bare, impossible to ignore. It didn't arrive promises through actions that couldn't be denied. I looked toward the pond, its still surface reflecting the blue sky above. A flock of ducks glided past, leaving behind faint ripples. I knew then, this chapter had closed. But the lessons would remain not just in my memory, but in the stories retold at the corner cafe, in the eyes of the elders whenever the past is recalled, in the quiet nods of those who once lived in fear, so that someday, if someone once again believes money can turn someone else's land into their personal playground, they will remember the image of the white Lamborghini sinking into the mud, remember the nickname Karen Lamborghini, and remember that justice always exists not in slogans, but in action, in every piece of land that knows how to speak and push back against violation. I closed my eyes, letting the afternoon breeze brush across my shoulders, weaving through hair that had turned silver. My heart was at ease. I didn't need anything more. No triumphant celebration, no titles, no recognition. The story had said everything it needed to say. Justice had shown itself. And I, at last, could go on living in peace, real peace. The story ends with the field returned to calm, the cattle roaming freely, the calf strong and healthy again, and my daughter's smile glowing on the lake. But to reach that moment, both I and the entire community had to walk a long road, filled with tension, confrontation, and sudden reversal. Now, looking back, I see clearly that every step wasn't merely a conflict between me and Claudia and Beatrice, but a whole epic about resistance, the limits of patience, and the enduring power of humble, persistent justice. The first truth this story exposes is simple. Power and wealth, when not grounded in morality, become a double-edged sword. Claudia and Beatrice once believed the Wellington name was an impenetrable shield. They used it to overpower, to mock, to trample others, treating the law like a joke and the community like private property. But that blind faith kept them from seeing the cracks spreading beneath them. When the community stopped bowing, when the law could no longer be bought, the Wellington shield fell away, revealing the truth beneath frail and exposed. That journey also taught me that patience has its limit, and when that line is crossed, resistance can erupt in ways no one expects. I once stayed silent when they sprayed mud on me, once endured when the livestock panicked, and once accepted the contempt during village meeting. But that silence wasn't surrender. It was time held in reserve, waiting for the right moment. And when that moment arrived, even a small patch of mud was enough to become a heavy verdict, awakening the entire community. The lesson here is not to seek revenge at all costs, but to hold on to the patiently, so that when it surfaces, carries the power to bring down an entire castle built on arrogance. The community in this story is also a central character. They were once silent, once let Wellington's arrogance prevail, but when faced with the naked truth, they changed. From turning away, they stood and applauded. From apathy, they openly acknowledged and defended my right. That moment made me believe that it is never too late for change. A community may be blinded by fear, but when that thread of fear snaps, its collective voice becomes stronger than any individual. In this story, social media also plays an undeniable role. Without those video clips, the truth might never have traveled so far. The images of the Lamborghini sinking in the mud, the reluctant confessions from Claudia, became weapons of justice, tools no farmer like me ever imagined having. Prove that justice in this new era doesn't rest solely in the hands of the law, but also in cell phone, in the millions of eyes watching and commenting. That power can unmask the arrogant, turn them into public spectacles, and, more importantly, it empowers those who once believed they were insignificant. I also learned that the greatest victory isn't making your opponent kneel, it's reclaiming peace within your own life. When Claudia and Beatrice left the neighborhood, I didn't feel triumphant in a vindictive way, nor did I harbor resentment. I just felt lighter, knowing that from now on, my fields, my family, and my community would live with dignity. That is the real victory, the victory of perseverance, of dignity, of believing that justice always exists. This story leaves behind a clear message. Power is not a permanent ticket, and reputation is not an invincible fortress. When built on contempt and injustice, both will collapse the moment truth rises. Claudia and Beatrice paid a steep price not with money, but with honor, with the disdain in the eyes of the community, with suffocating isolation. And that price is proof that no one can trample over others forever. As for me, the most important lesson is this: justice is not some distant concept, can be as simple as a patch of mud. Because justice doesn't need flowery words, it only needs a moment strong enough to expose the truth. When the luxury car's wheels sank into the soft earth, no argument could justify it, no power could undo it. All that remained was the truth, made visible, and that truth was enough to rewrite everything. And so, as I sit by the lake with my fishing rod, listening to my daughter's laughter ring out, I understand that this journey was never just mine. It is the story of anyone who has ever been belittled, pushed to the margins, treated as if invisible. It speaks to them, reminding them that the truth never disappears, that justice may arrive late, but when it does, it is more powerful than any disguise. I end with the words I once said: never believe that money gives you the right to trample others. Land and people both have limits to what they can endure. Once that line is crossed, the price will be more bitter than any punishment. And sometimes, all justice needs is a patch of mud. These are not words meant only for Claudia and Beatrice, but a warning for all of us. Because in the end, what matters is not what we hold in our hands, but how we treat one another. Respect, compassion, faith, and justice, those are the true foundations of any lasting community. And this story, with all its tension and its unexpected collapse, is the clearest proof of that.